Let's get ready to RPG!
RPG! RPG! RPG! RPG! RPG!
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Night's Last Call. My name is Derek Melenda, and we are back tonight to talk about more dungeons. We had a Patreon poll earlier this week, and we voted for to talk about Break, which we talked about on Tuesday, but some people still want to talk about dungeons. We have a number of patrons who are planning on running some dungeons and maybe mega dungeons, and so I think it's a worthwhile thing to talk about. Plus, I think that there's I think there's value in in all of these different conversations about dungeons, because I think it makes you focus on the actual intent of your play pattern of the design of your game. And I think that while the dungeon probably isn't the ideal environment for a linear railroad, I do think that there is a lot to be learned about just general sandbox principles by looking into dungeons as well. Ben says, Dungeon Stream should have had a dungeon synth intro, a missed opportunity. As I read this, I am very upset. I think we did that for one stream, Ben. I think we used I found a YouTube dungeon synth, that sort of retro dungeon synth. It was pretty good, but you're right. It was a missed opportunity. My bad. Just dungeon, no dragons. Yes. Although I will say I've never actually done this, but I like the idea of doing this, is to have, this is like a archetypal mega dungeon, right? 20 level mega dungeon, 20 levels of D&D, and each level has a dragon. And so throughout the course of the game, you start off fighting, I don't know, wormlings, and a white wormling, and then maybe a wormling black, and then a wormling blue or something like that. And then you make your way up through the sizes, and then you end the game on some massive, gargantuan ancient red dragon on the 20th level and just fight your way up through the chromatics, you know, or maybe you, you know, if you want to get saucy, you toss in some metallics or something that have been corrupted or some weird gem dragons. Maybe you literally just make it so that there's one dragon of each. But I don't know. I thought that would always be kind of cool, you know. Especially if there's sort of like a pattern to it. And so you start like, it's almost like Mega Man, right? Where, you know, you'd go fight Buzzsaw Man. I don't remember his name, but you'd go fight Buzzsaw Man before you would go fight Woodman. Or was it Cut Man? You'd go fight Cut Man before you fight Woodman because the Cut Man weapon was really good. So like on the one level, you could find a bunch of like ice weapons that would let you easily beat the red dragon. And then you could go to the other level and get a bunch of like, I don't know, acid protection gear before you went and fought the black dragon, right? And you could kind of do that and scale that as you go through the game. So yeah, anyways, all dungeons re-ranked. That wouldn't be, I mean, the problem there is I don't know every single dungeon, and a lot of dungeons that I do know, maybe a lot of people don't know, but it would be kind of interesting. I don't know how we would do it in a way that would be plausible, would be to go through not just, you know, maybe probably the classic dungeons and maybe rank them and actually take a look at them. But I'd be wary of spoilers. I don't want to spoil anything for anybody. What's up, Derek? Welcome to the dungeon. We've got fun and games. You can roll whatever you want, but you won't make your saves. All right, that was my horrible Axl Rose. What's up, GM Scott? Sam, welcome. We got a question in the copper from Sam. We're going to get to that. The patrons have loaded me up with questions, so we're going to be looking through those as I go through this thread and kind of hopefully spend some time answering everybody's questions. What's up, Shadram? Hello, Roman. Satir, hello. Tundalus, welcome. Woodland Fellowship, indeed. RPG. Lord Dragon, yo, what's up? So GM Scott, you know, we're going to kind of, as we go through the introductions here, I don't know if I'm going to have the ability to quote everybody's text, but we did have a question or a comment from our patron, Broberso. And he said, just trying to think of a question to make you talk about The Eyes of the Stone Thief, which is a 13th Age adventure. Multiple flavorful areas, lots of factions you can ally with or fight or make devil's bargain with. That's all great. Big, bold, fantasy, flavorful areas, A+ as a dungeon. 2, factions that you can either ally with or fight against, or maybe, you know, it's complicated relationship. Great. The whole dungeon is alive thing, I will admit, I don't really like. So like, it's not that I think that it's a horrible idea. It's just one of those, it doesn't appeal to me. The whole dungeon is a living creature thing and it like emerges onto the surface and pulls things down. That was like something that I was like, miss me with that. I don't like that. So, but so that is interesting that yes, I that idea has never been one that's been appealing to me. Interestingly. What's up, Sorrel? Good to see you. See, Ben is just better than me in almost everything. It has to end with Tiamat. Of course it does. Now I'm envisioning playing a dungeon game with Dwarven Forge, and I have an excuse to go buy that massive, you know which one I'm talking about, right? The massive Tiamat model, the one that's just like unreasonably and disturbingly expensive. Tiamat massive miniature. You know which one I'm talking about, right? It's just ungodly thing. It's like hundreds of dollars. Yeah. Boom. That's it. Look at this thing. Massive. Trying to pull this up. Oh, damn you, whiz kids. Okay, this has got to go. There we go. This thing. This like massive Tiamat miniature. Look at this thing. Thing's massive. Unfortunately, I closed this thing off and now it's locked in place. Anyways, yeah, that'd be awesome. You know, maybe it was more expensive, but they just, you know, maybe the price went down. But it's supposed to be huge. It's like the base is like a foot. you know, like it's like a 12-foot square. It's like that big, you know? Oh no. I lost my things. There we go. Okay, sorry. Everything's going crazy here. I lost my YouTube thing because I accidentally closed this window and it destroyed my stuff here. Okay. All right, let me see here. Yeah, I thought it would have been like $1,200. Nope, just $400. I think it was pre-painted, you know? I think it was good. Yeah, Cut Man. Yeah. Why go red when you have Leshy Dragons? Look, because we have to have, you know, enough is enough. We have to have a limit. Yeah, you put the Black Dragon Slaying Sword in the Dragon Horde. I got it. Put the dragons in the dungeon. Absolutely, Ken. Good evening. I just don't get the appeal of dungeons as a small part of an adventure that you have to get through to the actual heart of the story. Sure, but just dungeon delving, I don't get it. Yeah, I mean, I think it's based in this same idea of, you know, exploring dangerous places. You know, why do people climb mountains? Why do people go cave diving? Why do people go scuba diving? It's adventure, you know. And the original game is, you know, it's a fantasy adventure game, you know, D&D and all those other stuff. It's not necessarily a heroic game. It was a game of adventure. What's up? Rule of Cool, Thaddeus, greetings. You can almost assuredly find them somewhere in the war zone. Absolutely. But yeah, I think it's pretty cool stuff. So yeah, so again, we're going to go today through the questions, or I should say the comments or questions. Now, some of these things are pretty generic, so I don't know that we'll be able to get through all of them. But like DM Rawlings says, top 10 common mistakes you see people make when designing dungeons. You know, I don't know if I have top 10 that I can just, you know, rattle off. It's not kind of a more of a holistic topic in its a sense. But I think the biggest mistakes, I don't know if we should go to the whiteboard just yet, but I think the biggest mistakes that people make, the most common mistakes. Yeah, that's probably a good idea. Hey, Sam, thank you.
Samuel Ward tipped $3. Before we get into the mega dungeon talk, is a more linear and short dungeon better for new players to the genre?
Short, yes. Linear, no. Because I think what makes the dungeon compelling and exciting is this idea, we're probably ending up going to the whiteboard, is this idea that the game is about making choices and that you are making these, you know, exciting, interesting decisions. And as a result of that, I think that you should be encouraging players to, you know, to do that. And if you come in here with a linear dungeon, then I think what's going to end up happening is that, you know, they're going to learn, okay, so we don't really make decisions in this game. We kind of just, you know, float around and we don't really do that much. I think if you come in with even a basic, you know, people talk about the 5-room dungeon, which I think is fine, but my problem with the 5-room dungeon is it doesn't really give you a ton of room for choices. If I had to generically design what I would probably consider to be the shortest but functional dungeon, that wasn't so large that it required like a ton of different, you know, inputs or anything like that, you would have, and remember, this is my symbol for like the entrance. So you'd have the entrance to the dungeon, a room, here, there, and maybe like that. Like that to me, and if you really want to, you can like go like that or something like that. That to me is there's like enough choices to make through this room, in this chamber. There's areas to explore. It's very simple. Because if you go with like a 5-room dungeon, obviously like you could do like, I guess that, but even that's like, I don't think that's as compelling. You know, so I think that small dungeons are good. You know, I think that overall you should start with something small And I think you should avoid linearity, though. And if you can't, what is this? 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So it's like 8 different areas or whatever, 8 different locations. I think that's a great number. I mean, I think that a lot of groups, this is definitely more than a session, but I think that most groups should be able to get through this in most standard D20 tile style games in about 2 to 3 sessions. And I think that's pretty good, I mean, long ago, the rule of thumb was that a half of page of graph paper, so I'm talking 8.5 by 11 graph paper, right? Well filled out with 10-foot squares of dungeon should last a session of play. That used to be the mantra. Now, combat was a lot faster back then, but the idea that and that was including mapping. 4 squares per inch or 5 square per inch. I mean, that doesn't make that big of a difference. Obviously, it's 20% difference, but I'm personally a fan of the 5 square per inch myself, although 4 square per inch is nicer if I'm adding little artistic flourishes. If I'm just doing straight up just lines, then I like 5 square inch. If I'm adding artistic flourishes, I like the 4 square per inch because it gives me a little bit more room to doodle and draw stuff in. So yeah, 2 rooms per hour in a dungeon feels fair. Now, of course, there's a couple of caveats to this. Number one, this is probably the biggest one, is I'm not assuming that that all of these rooms necessarily contain some sort of combat. Okay, here's where this old school metric came from. Okay, the idea was that number one, not every room, right? So combat was not in every room. Not every encounter was combat. 2, right? Not every creature was hostile. We've talked about this many times on this channel, but there's this idea of the reaction chart, right? So I could put in, room 7 here. I could put a gang of goblins, ostensibly, lawful neutral evil goblins or chaotic evil goblins, or I could put bandits. And when the group enters, I maybe I know a little bit about these goblins, right? They're hiding out here, raiding from the nearby, they're raiding the nearby elven village or something. But when the players come in, I roll the reaction table and they're wary, or they're not friendly, but they're not hostile, or maybe they're even friendly. And suddenly, this idea of, well, that's going to be a fight isn't a fight. So when you suddenly start thinking about the fact that not every one of these rooms contains a combat, and then the rooms that do, quote unquote, contain a combat might randomly, because of reaction rolls or players' decisions, be, sort of skipped because of a reaction table. What was going to be a big fight turns into, a 10-minute back and forth, maybe a couple skill checks, maybe it's just some in-character description, maybe it's just describing, we salute the goblins and we go on our way. So then suddenly this encounter takes 10 minutes, and then you're moving on, and you can cover a lot of ground that way. And then obviously too, in older editions of the game, combat was a lot faster. It tended to be theater of the mind. There was a lot less tactical nuance and crunch in terms of like the mechanics of the game. You didn't have all these feats and powers, and spells were a lot more limited in their own way. If you're talking Pathfinder 2nd edition or 4th edition D&D, or probably even 5th edition D&D, those combats can take longer. And obviously, if you start busting out every time there's a combat, you're busting out a grid and you're drawing a map and you're moving minis and you got people counting squares, it's going to take you a lot longer to get through the same number of rooms. And I had something else I wanted to say. I don't remember what it was, but yes, the idea is that it's a place to sort of explore and be surprised, both as the GM and the player. So I think that a small dungeon is fine. I think it can be overwhelming when you start making it too big. there's a sense of accomplishment that comes from, defeat, kind of going in there, exploring the space, learning a little bit about it and getting out. But I think it's a mistake to make it linear. So, let's see here. Some take forever, some are pass through. Absolutely. I should also note again that if you do have a combat and you do have a fight with these goblins, okay, maybe there's 12 goblins, and after 2 rounds of combat or 3 rounds of combat, a couple goblins have died. They're down to 9 goblins, and the remaining goblins flee, or surrender, or try to rush past the players and head for the exit. So even that long fight gets, curtailed and shortened down into a lesser time. So question about Torchbearer. So Rule of Cool. I will do one question from the group, but I am trying to do this stuff off of the patrons who asked first in the chat in the Discord. A question about Torchbearer. Will any published dungeon work, or does it have to be tailored to the system? Rapanathuk. I think any dungeon could work. You'd have to make a couple, minor modifications to the most part, but I think any dungeon should work. The creators of Torchbearer say that, beware of doing big, long dungeons because it can take, it doesn't have to be that long to go through it. And that you tend to have a lot more, gameplay on any one individual encounter because, there's a lot more strategizing that goes into it as opposed to a standard D&D game. But I personally think anything could work. So, let's see here. Ben says, ideally, the DM will have maps for the major areas and a few generic rooms or the ability to make them quickly. Mappers should not be drawing a detailed map. This isn't art school. This isn't art school. So I agree completely with Ben. I mean, there's a part of me that loves the idea of the player sitting there with graph paper and jotting down every 20-foot square and room and every 10-foot wide hallway. But for the most part, the map is just a navigation tool and a way for the players to start to get a feel and a vibe for the dungeon. In fact, in my one famous mega dungeon that I ran, the mapper, Zach, he mapped for so long that he didn't need the map anymore. He was the map, right? I'm the map, right? From the Mummy. And he could guide the party through multiple dungeon levels just from memory. And that's a really cool element of mastery. Okay. Let me go back to, so Rich is one of my buddies. So for him, it isn't. So Ben says it's not art school. Well, my buddy Rich is an artist. And when he draws a map, he's shading it in and adding little images of the creatures they fought and little things. And it becomes a work of art. In fact, some of those maps are some of my favorite sort of artifacts from the years of us playing together. But I think that's, again, you're turning it into this expression of you as a character and you as a player, rather than it being a game aid, which is fine. But yes, he does add the detail. But again, because he wants to, not because he has to. All right. So next question. Let's see here. So top 10 common mistakes I see when people making designing dungeons. So the most common mistakes I see when people make dungeons. Number 1 is they make them too linear. Number 2 is they put way too many combats in there. Number 3, they put stupid traps in there, which is the biggest thing that you could do to hurt your game exploration. We can talk a whole thing about traps, but long story short, maybe this was an old school thing, but I think just putting the random trap in the random hallway is stupid and problematic. It leads to, bad behaviors, and I think it's very problematic. 4, the dungeon has to have some sort of resource pressure. No matter how you do it, there has to be a reason why the group feels like the dungeon is scary. Go watch a YouTube video of people going cave diving, of going spelunking, of climbing, going down into and there's no monsters in there. It's just a cave. It feels scary. It feels claustrophobic. You want to recreate that tension. You want to bring that in. So you need to make the dungeon feel like it's a hostile environment, that there's a pressure on them, that the resources are always ticking. Now, in the era of kick in the door, be a badass, modern big play D20, that is not always, the same thing. So you need that resource pressure, and it can be tough because a lot of these modern D20 games are designed for the characters not to really feel that pressure. Don't make it just a bunch of rooms and combats. I think that's probably the biggest mistake that people make is just, hey, I'm going to draw a map and I'm going to fill it with monsters. I think that's the biggest problem. Or I've talked about this before. I think starting with the dungeon with this, like, I want to put these monsters, and you can do that. But I think designing the dungeon as an interesting play space first through a good map is going to be far more rewarding than anything else. So actually, that might be the number one mistake is when people just fill it with monsters and treasures. And it's just like you open up the door and here's some goblins, and then you open up the next door and there's just a displacer beast. And there's nothing in here. The GM is just randomly rolled for, oh, there's some curtains in this room and some broken tapestry. And it means nothing. I just rolled it out of a random table or, off of some random roller. You can do that, and some groups might be more than happy up to do that. But I think that's just, it kills the interest for me in a dungeon. Because I've talked about this before, about the layers. I think every dungeon should have a history. And ideally, that history should help the players in some capacity. It should give them some sort of advantage if they, dig down through the layers. And sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it's just for fun. I mean, like I said, you can reward that. You can reward XP for people discovering the lore of the dungeon and figuring out about what happened here in the past or whatever. But I think that if you can tie these areas and these rooms together, then you're creating this experience. And as the players move through the dungeon, they're discovering the dungeon. And I think that is, really cool. So probably the biggest cardinal mistake is honestly just filling it with a bunch of monsters and treasure and just calling it good. I think that's problematic and very lazy design. Let's see here. Oaken Stout says, for systems that are heavily grid-based, what would be your ideal solution for using a point crawl for exploration, but then having to zoom in to a gridded room for combat? He said, my group briefly played Abomination Vaults and Foundry, and it was slow to move everyone on the map. I was tempted to change it into a point crawl, but then we would have had difficulty running combat theory of the mind path. Okay, easy. Number one, I think the worst thing that exists in the modern VTT era today is the whole dungeon map as a 5-foot square VTT map, and the players are moving their pieces around like it's fucking, I don't know, Hero Quest or, Descent or something, or Gloomhaven. I think that is fucking horrible. I think that the maps should be for the room where you're going to have a fight if you need to have one, if you want to keep on your grid-based combat. When I used to GM, back in the day on my Chessex mat and stuff like that and playing D&D 3rd edition, it was all descriptive, 50-foot corridor branching into a T section. We might have a mapper who's drawing a map, but it was all descriptive and all theater of the mind. And then if we needed to have a fight or a combat, I'd put down the Chessex mat or I'd put down the dry erase tactiles. We'd quickly sketch out or draw a room. We'd put some minis down, and then we'd have our grid-based combat. But I think it is a huge mistake, a cardinal mistake, to literally have the PCs moving their mini down the corridor and having the dynamic lighting on and having all your walls on. And I just think that it's a horrible problem. And it's made all the more worse. And Jason here is actually bringing up the point with this. The modern dungeons are so small, it's embarrassing. Like the modern dungeon is literally smaller than like a big house. Like I'm talking about like a sizable house, but it's like ridiculously small. It's not even half the length of a football field, right? It's maybe 100 feet. And, you've got characters who can move. You have characters that, if they wanted to, they could take a run action or a dash action, or they could triple, use all 3 actions to stride and literally move from one side of the dungeon map to the other side of the dungeon map in a single 6-second turn, assuming there was no doors or anything like that. But still, that's dumb and crazy dumb. Like, when everyone has all these questions and problems about like, why doesn't every single monster just come descend upon them? Yeah, they should, because you're fighting in the equivalent of a 3-bedroom house. and you're fighting in the living room, and the next monster encounter is in the kitchen. And there's 2 more encounters upstairs. It's ridiculously too small. So not only are those dungeons way too tiny, period. But number 2, I think that the whole moving your minis around the dungeon map is bad. So the answer to Oakenstout's question is, I would use a point crawl or like a theater of the mind for exploration and describing things. And I would only use the VTT gridded map as needed for specifically the combat encounter. And maybe you don't have much more than just that room and some of the nearby corridors mapped for the PCs to even engage with. And you basically turn the combat, unfortunately, gets turned into a kind of, again, I know there are people out there with, aphantasia, and they can't imagine anything or whatever. But I have found in my experience that the quickest and easiest way to make sure that your players never, ever once visualize or remember what your dungeon looks like is to have them have a top-down map view of it. If it looks really amazing and really great, like maybe like Dwarven Forge, and you've got custom miniatures made because your name's Matt Mercer or something, and they're floating on wire land bergs floating above the sky, and you've got lighting effects. Okay, maybe they'll remember that very fondly. But for the most of us, even if it's just your standard, dungeon that you got on the PDF and you've got the map in the VTT, I think when people see that, their minds check out, right? Our imaginations take the path of least resistance. And once you give somebody this basic 30-foot by 20-foot room with however many squares, 24 squares in it, they just think of it in terms of circles and little monster images and squares, and they're moving, and like the whole imagination just goes out the window. But I think outside of that place where we don't need the grid, because we don't need people to have precise understanding of where they are, especially for the rule, for the rules. A lot of rules in these games require precise understanding of where you are, which is fine. It's not like I've not played on a ton of gridded combat before. But outside of that, you got to ditch that. And one of my personal pet peeves is like when people are in the room and they're like, I'm going to go check out this door. And then they like take their token and they drag it over to that door. And then the GM is like, oh, I put in a sound effect and a little click. And when you click the door, it opens up. And I hate like the fact that like Foundry included that, to me, is like gross. It's gross. So also I got to crack a window. It's warm in here. It's almost 50 degrees Fahrenheit here today. It was like 48 or something. It got warm. Fair enough, Satir. That's great. Again, I don't want to exclude anybody who has aphantasia, but at the same time, I do think that, describing things is the way that you get it into people's mind. And the more you can do that, the more you can't. Or the more you can do that, the better. And if you can't do it because you need a grid and because people need to be able to understand precisely where they are, that's fine. But then do that as minimally as possible is my move. So that was Oakenstout's question. Let's see. Omniscitoad said, I'm really interested in dungeon node exploration and how that might work in relation to mega dungeons, as opposed to actually fully mapped out dungeons and detailed rooms. I was thinking of doing something from the Angry GM, rolling a D6, and if you happen upon a particular set of rooms in a region first, maybe more linear in another region, how does dungeon-based node-based exploration work without it just becoming an overland point crawl with dungeon trappings? So, I mean, what it really comes down to is you need a way to make sure that let me put it another way. Do you really care about the 30 or 50 or 80 feet of corridor between the rooms? Is that really interesting? I mean, if it is, and your players enjoy that, kind of wandering around the corridors and the hallways, then by all means, make a normal dungeon map. And plus, I think aesthetically that they are very nice. I think there's a lot of enjoyment to that. But a lot of times it's a lot of squeeze for very little juice. There's not a lot of stuff that's going on around in those hallways or in those, places between the major rooms. Secondly, and I've talked about this before, it may be realistic, and there may even be a value to it in the sense of like having a place to retreat and fall back. And I get that. And if players really ask, I'm sure you can describe it. But I think that just like the random empty rooms in if you go back to a lot of these old school, new school dungeons, they're too small, but most of the rooms are pretty full. If you go to a lot of these old school dungeons, especially some of these new old school dungeons, there's a ton of just completely empty rooms with just like nothing in them. And I quite frankly just don't have time for that anymore. Like maybe it's realistic, maybe it gives places, but I want my encounters to sing. And I want the areas of the rooms to be sort of these set, kind of like important places, these set places, like, right? Like I want to give it a name, right? Like I don't want this to just to be, room 2, but like, did my thing turn off? It did. Like I want this to be, what do we have? Here we go. There we go. Like I want room 2 to be, the Iron Bastion. And you're like, what is that? Like, and the way I think of it is if you've played like a video game or you played World of Warcraft or MMO, how like when you walk into certain areas or you walk into certain rooms, like the title of the room will appear on screen as you enter into that area. That's kind of what I'm going for with a node-based dungeon or a point crawl-based dungeon. I want every area to be memorable and unique. I am purposefully kind of abstracting and sort of ignoring the connections between them. I'm more interested in the room itself and the encounter, that is there, whether it's a combat encounter or whether it's a whatever. And then the choices ultimately that you're making, right? Because these nodes are going to connect to different places. And I want to focus on the encounter, the actions the players take there, the choices that they make, the information that they learn. Remember, an encounter doesn't have to mean a fight, doesn't have to be a trap. Sometimes an encounter can just be an opportunity for the players to interact with the environment and learn from it, and etc. And yes, I'm giving up this random walking around, but I think it's better. Hey, Dr. Metropolis, thank you.
He had a fun book I really liked called Into the Unknown, The Dungeon Survival Guide. This book plus the 4 EDMG half are great tools for dungeon design.
Although, here's the thing, what the most disappointing thing about this book is? It is like this thin. It is freakishly thin. It's too thin. Anyways, it was a cool book. There's definitely an art and a science, Dr. Metropolis, to exploring dungeons, and I think that we should kind of I like that there's kind of a skill to it as well, So, going back to Omniscitoad, I think that it's fine to do a point crawl based dungeon, and the key is you need to focus on those rooms, and you need to focus on those, and again, a node doesn't have to necessarily be a single room, right? A node could be a couple of rooms, right? It could be the hobgoblin, the hobgoblin lair. It could be area 4, right? And you could make that a series of rooms, maybe with a series of encounters. It doesn't have to necessarily just literally be one thing. But for me, and again, you could say that I'm one of those put the fantasy and put the fantastical back in fantasy. If I'm doing this is an opportunity for me to make a cool impression. And I've played a lot of D&D. I've run a lot of D&D, and I am just as guilty of this as anybody else. I've had way too many rooms that I have run, that I have created, that was essentially, just another basic room. Oh, it had some pillars in it. And like, it just had no style. It had no flair. It had no character. It was just a vanilla room that just fell flat. It was probably just a holding place for monsters that the PCs killed. And I think that if you're going to do a node-based design and you're going to do a point crawl-based design, then you need to move away from that as much as possible. You really need to focus on, because you need to get as much bang for your buck out of the limited number of locations that you can, and have people really resonate with them. Now, they don't all have to be like, it's a magical flaming fountain that shoots diamonds of gold. It doesn't have to be that. But just even doing something like, you know, it's a large room with pillars, but in the center of the room, you know, in the cobblestones, there's a massive mosaic of a rearing dragon or something, you know, some sort of artwork made into the thing. And, you know, you could think of it as, you know, the map, the art room, the mat room, you know, so if the players can naturally just give the room a name, even if it's their name, and you're like, yeah, it's the big fucking hand room. Okay, that actually works great, right? As long as the players, that means it means something to the players. It's the big fucking hand room. And sure, you know that it's actually secretly like, you know, I don't know, like a petrified giant who's partially buried underneath the dungeon floor or something like that, and his hand is sticking up out of the ground. But they call it the big fucking hand room, you know, or they call it, you know, the hand throne room or whatever. So I think making these rooms, you know, boom, stick out is the key to making that happen. Exactly, George. The room with 3 swords. And again, George is a player of mine for many, many years. And you don't really need a better description for that than that, because for them, that meant something, the room with the 3 swords. And it stood out and was different. It was unique. And, you know, that room didn't have any combats in it, but it did have a very big impact on the campaign later on. So, let's see. I'm sorry if I'm skipping, if some people ask multiple questions, but I want to try to get to like everybody, at least one question from everybody here. What if we only like small dungeons? Boothby said. That's fine. In fact, I think that there is maybe, I don't want to say more value, but I think there is something to be said about, you know, the kind of Caves of Chaos based approach, right? Where you have, you know, this ravine, and, you know, here's dungeon 1, which is, you know, again, I'm just doing quick little node sketches here. You know, here's dungeon 1, and here's dungeon 2. And here's dungeon 3. And maybe they tell a series of stories, or maybe instead of a ravine, this is actually something I might do for my Torchbearer game. I'm thinking about creating it, and this is, again, I'm always inspired by things like Tolkien and stuff like that. But I'm thinking of having an area, you know, called like the Barrow lands, or maybe like the Barrow Fields, and it's just an ancient land where, you know, there's these ancient tombs that are sort of scattered throughout the lands. And every so often, you know, a lot of them have been found and looted over the years or cursed, but, you know, there's still maybe, you know, kind of like a King Tut type thing. There's some of the richest kings or princes that once ruled this land. Their tombs remain unfound, you know, after, you know, several hundreds of years, you know, 1,000 years now, they, you know, mostly look like overgrown hills. And occasionally people find them and they, you know, go down into them and discover what treasures there are. And you could have, you know, 10, 12 different of these little mini dungeons. And maybe together they all kind of link in to tell the story of the Barrowlands. And each different little cave has its own little story, or has its own little unique bit of history. But together, each one maybe has one part of a greater puzzle that, you know, you start to put together as you explore these series of encounters or series of mini dungeons. And in this way, your group can get through these in, you know, I don't know, you know, probably not one to 3 sessions, give or take. And they get that sense of accomplishment of like, yep, we didn't, maybe they didn't go to every single room. That's quite all right. But they're like, hey, we went in there and we remember we explored that big scary thing, and we went over here and we came over here, and then we got to the end chamber, and there was this, there was a white, you know, the prince had risen as a white, and he was wielding his blackened alloy bastard sword, and it was a light with an unholy flame, and we fought him, and it was an awesome fight, and everybody thought it was cool. The other thing that's really fun about this kind of design is, you know, let's assume for a moment that like this first little micro dungeon, right? It's like made for your like level 1 party. And then over here, this is made for your level 2 party or whatever. But then you could put an encounter like maybe this room here. Maybe this room is, is a CR7 monster, some sort of guardian, right? Like in the midst of this tomb, there's a room guarded by an iron golem. There's no way that a level 2 party is going to fight an iron golem. And they might wonder about it. They might question about it. They may not, whatever. They might go, damn, okay. But then maybe months later, after they've accomplished another series of dungeons, and now they're like level 6 or 7, and they go, hey, we never did go back to that burrow and find out what's up with that iron golem. And now we could totally fight it. And then they go back and they fight it and they beat it. And then they discover some really cool treasure, some really cool bit of lore. And, and they think to themselves like, man, what if we'd been able to get this back when we were level 2? That would have been amazing. It just kind of congeals. And not only does it tie the fiction of your campaign together, it ties the actual playing of your game, right? It's like the never ending story. You are telling the story of your PCs in this fictional world, but you're also telling the story of you and your group of players and GM sitting around playing the game. You're writing your own history as you go through this process. And I think that is something that I think is very valuable. All right. DM Rawlings says, comment on the 5-room dungeon approach, maybe. I think I kind of already did this, but generally speaking, I think it's okay. I just think it's a little lacking. I just think that it doesn't give enough choices, and it's a little under. I think it's a little too linear, and I think it's it's not enough. I think like the 8-room dungeon is probably better. Whereas like the 5-room dungeon is sort of designed with this idea, I think, of, well, we want to be able to hit every single room in a single session, because the idea of us not clearing out the dungeon is not acceptable. So while I think the mentality behind it is fine, I think it is a little bit not problematic. But back in the day, Andy Collins, who wrote for 4th edition and D&D for a while, he used to also write for the RPGA, and he created this. RPGA was like the old Adventures League before, and he created this article called 200 Minutes and the Bonus Encounter, and this was designed for RPGA play. And the idea was, in an RPGA at a convention, you had 4 hours, so you had 240 minutes, and reasonably you could expect to lose 40 of those minutes to player prep, sitting down, getting everything ready. So that left you with 200 minutes of gameplay that you needed to prepare for your RPGA session or adventure, which was by definition a one-shot. And he talked about how, depending on what level you're at, so like at low levels, maybe people need 30 minutes to get through an encounter, and then maybe at higher levels they need something like 45 minutes or something to get through an encounter. But either way, that kind of gives you an indication of what you want to do. So let's say that you expect for most of your encounters to take 30 minutes. So you've got 200 minutes, so you're going to plan 6 encounters. But you always plan +1 bonus in case the players finish early, or they get really lucky and they're just crushing it, or they want to take on an extra challenge. By having sort of 6 + 1 bonus, you kind of set yourself up ideally for this sort of one-shot kind of mentality. But I don't really like designing one-shots, because I don't really like one-shots, so. Nick says, on the joy of traps and their proper usage. So the answer for me is, I think putting traps in the middle of dungeon hallways is like the dumbest thing. I think the best traps that we've all seen from years of watching movies are the traps that are there, essentially. Traps should guard something. I think traps should be kind of dangerous and kind of deadly. I think traps should be like, you shouldn't think about the trap and the purpose of the trap. You should think about the purpose of the trap as like, why is the trap here? What is the trap trying to do? What is the trap trying to protect? Or what is the trap trying to accomplish? And if the purpose of the trap is, to kill people, then depending on the level, of course, there's a scaling there. But I think that the threat should be there. The classic 20-foot pit trap, all right, or the 30-foot pit trap, 20-foot pit trap, whatever it is. I mean, that's 2d6 damage, right? In the classic D&D mantra. That's going to kill most first-level PCs in D&D, straight up. And you die at 0. So for me, the fun of a trap is not the fun of the trap is not the players finding it and then making a check and then getting past it. And it's not really them getting hit by it. I think for me, the fun of the trap is when the players go, there's totally a trap here. And of course there's a trap here. This room screams trap. And so now we have to kind of engage with it on that level. We have to start thinking about, where could the trap be? And hey, Duncan, thank you.
Duncan DT tipped $5. You have talked about cycles before in Dungeons. I'm unsure how to make the backtrack feel valuable and not just a hey, can we fast track this part and just get to the room the key belongs to?
Great question, Duncan. So we can get to that. Just let me finish that up. This thing really quick here about traps. So for me, when I think about a trap, I think about 3 things. I think about the trap mechanism, like what is the trap itself? What is the trigger? And what is it protecting, or what is it trying to prevent? And this gives you sort of 3 ways that the players can approach the trap in a, problem-solving type approach. And I'll be completely honest with you, it is way more fun for the players to interact with the trap like it's some sort of challenge or puzzle than it is to just make a check. And to do that, they have to know that the trap is there. And this could be anything from, like, I had a trap. It was like a poison gas trap in my Forbidden Lands game. And there was a big stone door. And around the edges of it were, all these carvings and engravings. And as they looked around the door, they saw that there were these carved holes around the outline and perimeter of the drawer. And so they used something from their inventory. I don't remember what it was. And they plugged up the holes. And I said, okay, that's great. You haven't disabled the trigger, but what you have done is made it very difficult for the trap gas to escape. So being able to interact with the trap on a logical basis, I think is just so much more fun. Something Grimtooth. I think the Grimtooth traps are kind of horrible because I think they are Rube Goldberg machines. I think they are just so wacky and wonky and needlessly almost like a movie where it's like Saw, So that's that. So that's number 1. Number 2, I don't think that a trap should make the players feel stupid. And sometimes people will design traps where it's, you go, oh, it's a trap. Of course it works like this. And they go, gotcha. You thought it worked like this. I was counting on you thinking it worked like this. And now it actually, by doing that, you've fallen right into my, you've fallen right into my trap card. And that was what I was hoping you would do. I personally find those kind of gotchas to be annoying and disappointing. And I basically, as a player, go, okay, I'm not going to interact. I'm not going to engage with your game anymore. Like, you're just punishing me, for that type of thing. Now, Samson says traps and corridors are guarding the way to the room. Totally viable, Sam. However, then it needs to be telegraphed. And essentially, it's no longer just a corridor, right? Because think of it this way. If you are putting a trap somewhere, it's because you want the people to not go that way. You want the people to turn around, right? A lot of these traps, even sometimes, are, who's resetting it? We maybe think magical or something like that. But I mean, for the most part, you want people to go, oh, there's a trap. We need to leave, we don't want to go down that way because it's scary and it'll kill us. So I'm not even going to test it. And you're like, cool. That was the whole point of this trapped hallway, was to ward people away. If you're like, my trap, if you go, my trap is hidden, so no one will know it's there. And now I say real world logic would dictate that the trap is placed where it is not expected. Maybe, I mean, it's not quite the same as a trap, but like at a bank, where is the bank alarm? You know, on the vault, on the front door. It's in the places you would expect it to be. You know, it's designed to protect this thing, and so that's where it is. But the other thing to consider is this isn't the real world. It's our imaginary fun game place, you know? And so, we want to play into that. But I think that telegraphing traps is far better than trying to conceal them. So for me, if you're coming into a room, I'm going to describe that there's a room beyond with a very rough, uneven cobblestone floor, with some of the cobblestones raising up several inches above the others, some of them being dropped down several inches lower, with moss and dirt spread out throughout the room. And the walls of the room are covered in strange symbols and carvings that are filled with holes. And in the center of the room, you can see a skeleton slumped to the ground, long ago rotted. And, there's dozens of arrows or something around the decayed bones. Oh, and there's a glittering pile of treasure, right? And so immediately you go, okay, I get it. We understand the basic premise of here. Now we get to engage with it. I mean, the way I think of it is, it's like, imagine having a combat encounter where you're like, all right, you guys are in combat, but you don't know you're in combat. And all the combatants are invisible, but I'm not going to tell you that you're in combat until I tell you that I've crit you. And you're like, okay, that could be a combat, but that's just not fun to interact with. It's just not fun to enjoy. I think it's much more fun when you can Jenga with the trap and Jenga with the encounter. So I think that's a lot more fun. In fact, I think the way to think of a trap is to think of it as like a combat. And think of it in that same kind of respect. And for the most part, if you can avoid just having it be, make a check and then you're done, I think that's probably a good thing. Nick also asked as a bonus question, how to write a room description / how you like to see them in modules. Well, I mean, I would say if you have a hard time with room descriptions, I got one word for you. I guess it's 2 words. I don't know. Chat GPT or, or Llama or something like that. Those are great for that type of thing, right? You can give it some very basic bullet point lists of information and then say, write me a 2 or 3 sentence description like it was a TTRPG adventure module, and it'll do a good job. Assuming you want to read a, boxed text to your players and you're bad with that. Yeah, I would just use ChatGPT for that or something like that. Would you say that traps are a type of puzzle? I distinguish, I know people were talking about this today on the Patreon. I distinguish between the puzzle, okay, and the challenge. Okay. I call it a puzzle. To me is like, a puzzle, it's like, it's something that you could see like in a puzzle book. A challenge is more of like a non-linear problem space that involves, using some of your spells and abilities and maybe some skill checks and figuring out how to sort of work your way through it. So I would say that traps are a challenge. I would not say that they are a puzzle. I mean, it's a very weird semantics, but for me, that when I think puzzle, I think, move the tiles so that they, link up, which is a different type of, maybe that's a different type of challenge, but to me, that's specifically the puzzle type challenge, but I think of it more as a challenge. Broken bridge is a trap or puzzle. Well, I would say it's a challenge. Like you come to the bridge, it's already broken. How do you get across? That to me is neither a trap nor a puzzle. It is a challenge. All right, next. Lollipop says, what makes a dungeon fun and interesting? I mean, that kind of is up to you and your group. What do you all like? For me personally, what makes a dungeon fun and interesting, what to include, what to exclude. For me, it's great, memorable locations, awesome, cool fights versus classic D&D monsters. It's great treasure, chests of coin and cool magical items. It's fun and wacky adventures and plans. It's great challenges that require non-linear, outside the box thinking. It's the fun of exploring and making decisions that impact the dungeon. We allied with the goblins. They helped us lead the assault against the orcs, but then they got eaten by the gelatinous cube, and then we fled for our life. And when we came back, the gelatinous cube had multiplied because it ate the entire goblin tribe, and now now there's 5 gelatinous cubes roaming through the dungeon, and it's now become this weird like game of cat and mouse as we all try to flee from these, these gelatinous cubes that kind of was our fault, but kind of not our fault. Like the more it just keeps going down that line, like that for me is how I make the dungeon fun and interesting. Yeah, I think Keith, I think the creepy atmosphere, like I said, I like to keep the idea of the dungeon tense, and I like to keep the tension going, but the creepiness is sort of I think it's more of an individual decision. I mean, I think if you go too like, like too jokey and like, oh, you're fighting killer clowns and they hit you with their laugh guns, I do think that can go over the top. And I think that if the dungeon is too funhousey, as the term would be, I think it can become a little bit, it can be more for the jokes than it is for the atmosphere. I think that can be problematic, but some groups might really like that. So I can't really hate on that too much. What are good usages of dungeons? What are bad usages of dungeons? The short answer to that is what makes a dungeon good is when the group is there to explore it and deal with it on their terms. When you put the dungeon in as a hurdle that is getting between the players and what they want to accomplish, then the dungeon no longer is a fun place to explore. It is a pain in the ass that you're being forced to go through by the DM. This is the case of most dungeons in most adventure paths. Like, even if on a fundamental level, if you really like dungeons, as a general style of play, you understand that the point of this adventure, or the point of this is we're supposed to go to this place and kill this lady before she can do this thing, and then we can continue on with the adventure path. But we'd love to, if it was up to us, we would just walk over to her and we would kill her. But they've put this dungeon in front of us, and it's a pain in our ass because we don't want to be exploring the dungeon. I don't want to be going through these rooms. These traps are not fun. I don't care about this stuff. It's just in my way to getting to the thing that I really want. Now, certainly there's a certain element of that in all RPGs, right? The GM's job is to put obstacles in the player's path between the things that they want to accomplish. But I think dungeons are woefully misused in this capacity, because what makes dungeons fun is when the players want to engage with them and the players want to explore them at their own pace. It's that self-pacing that I think is, now there could be a sense of urgency. I think that's totally valid, right? But, LP says, would the Goonies do it? So the Goonies is actually kind of a great example, because the Goonies certainly have motivation, right? They need to get They need to get They need to get One-Eye Willie's treasure, right, to save their homes. But it's not like they need to do it, tonight. There's this idea of like, we're going to do it. And if for whatever reason they had to leave, it's not like the end of the world would happen. They have a motivation to do it, but they are mostly kind of exploring it at their own volition. The dungeon is their friend. The dungeon is giving them the opportunity to find this treasure, to save their homes. So they actually kind of view the dungeon as their buddy. So I think that's a kind of an interesting way to think about it. Oh, Goonies was a classic. Goonies is great. Thoughts on if a mega dungeon, Lord Dragon asks, thoughts on if a mega dungeon could work in an urban environment, like if the city itself was the mega dungeon. Would that change how you would build and run a mega dungeon? Well, I think the biggest problem that you would have is that you would need to figure out a way to keep the tension high, right? You would need to figure out a way to keep the players from just being able to go rest very easily. That's certainly one of the easiest ways to pretty much kill any dungeon. And I'm not going to lie, like there are some games, maybe Pathfinder 2, that fundamentally are challenged in that way. Undermountain is an example of that, because, you know, it's dangerous, it's deadly, but it's also like right underneath Waterdeep, so you can kind of just go up and there you're in Waterdeep. So I think that is sometimes problematic. It depends on how good you are at trapping and locking them and getting them to go deeper, because that's the real problem with the modern day dungeon. You want the dungeon to feel like a press your luck mechanic. I'm trying to think of, I don't play a lot of video games, but like I'm trying to think of like, and you know, I know there's people here in chat who've like have played like the Gardens of Yin and the Stygian Library, but I like this idea of like, okay, you fought your encounter, you got your experience, you got your little bit of treasure. You could go back to town right now, or you know, you could go ahead and get double or nothing. And you're like, ooh, okay, let's go ahead. So you go ahead, and then it's like, okay, you beat that encounter. All right, triple or nothing. And you just keep like upping the stakes. And now the players are going deeper and deeper, and they're getting more and more in over their heads. And they could have turned around and backed out at any time, but eventually they've dug themselves too deep. And now they have actually, you know, the ability to just turn around and go home is no longer as much of an option. Now they have to go back through the dungeon. Now they have to go back through potentially encounters. This is one of the reasons why random encounters were so important, because you could never count on the fact that you just, you know, oh, I cleared that room and I cleared that room and I cleared that room and I cleared that room. So, okay, we'll turn around and go home. And we're just gonna be able to go boop, 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 because there's not gonna be anything there because we've killed every living creature that existed. And this isn't true for like in old school games. This is not true for like two reasons. One, random encounters. Two, a lot of monsters fled when you fought them. And so by the time you're going back that way, it's been 20 minutes, 30 minutes, an hour, 2 hours. And they have kind of, you know, repopulated the area. So incentivize players with rewards to keep going. I think that the carrot can work very well, and, you know, giving them some sort of increasing or escalating bonus. And we've talked about this before, but like imagine this is a very, you know, simple example, but imagine a dungeon where you have where you have just, and this is again an old school dungeon. So you have room 1, you have room 2, you have room 3, okay, you have room 4, and you have room 5. Okay, that's very basic. Okay, and off of room 3, there is the minor treasure. And off of room 5, there is the big treasure. Right? Great stuff. Now, imagine you're playing a game where fighting and killing monsters doesn't really give you that much XP, and that encountering and fighting monsters is potentially dangerous and could kill you. Well, now, if you go into the dungeon and you fight the monsters in room 1, and you take them out, and then you go and you fight the monsters in room 2, and you take them out, and then you leave and go back to town to, you know, heal up, then when you return to the dungeon, why is this not working? Oh. There we go. When you return to the dungeon, those rooms or encounters may very well have basically repopulated. Now, keep in mind, you didn't really get that much experience. You didn't get any treasure. So you just fought and potentially risked your character's life for really nothing. You didn't really get anything from that. So the only way that you're going to be able to get even the slightest a bit is to go into 1 and kill it, and go into 2 and kill it. Remember, this is a very simplified model. And then go into 3 and kill that. And then it's like, okay, you get the minor treasure. But you know that ahead is the big treasure. But now you've already gone through 3 fights. Now you could take your minor treasure and go home And then when you come back, you're like, okay, let's try to get for the big treasure. And then you go in the big treasure and you're like, okay, now I have to go through all 5 of these fights to get to it. So there's this idea that if you want to be rewarded, you have to go deep. You have to put yourself into danger or into risk, especially if, depending on how the players are resting or recovering or taking their time, if when the players come in, they take out room 1, they take out room 2, they take out room 3, and then they decide to rest. And while they're waiting to go into room 4, room 1 and room 2, the creatures have already come back. Like they're already plotting. They're already, doing something. Now, granted, remember, a dungeon should be an area where the players feel like this place was wild and feral and we didn't have any control over it. But you know what? We did something. We participate. We were able to conquer and change this environment. So maybe the players keep getting ambushed by the goblins. Maybe they decide we're going to take the goblins out. Like we're going to go out on like a crusade to just wipe them out. Or maybe they strike a deal with them and they say, hey, look, we're going to broker passage through this so we don't have to keep fighting you guys every time or something. And now the players suddenly find that they can access the deeper parts of the dungeon easier. But it's not because the adventure told you to. It's because the players did something to deal with this problem. And I think that's what makes it so satisfying, is this idea that you can shape and change the environment, to benefit you. Well, to be fair, George, if the players were sensible, they would also retire after like the first adventure when they have like hundreds of gold, maybe thousands of gold, more money than they've ever seen in their entire life times 20. And they'd be like, look, I could buy a farm, I could buy a bar, I could live comfortably for the rest of my life. And we're all retiring at level 2 and 3. So if the dungeon has to be something the PCs want to go and explore, which they do, what if they don't? Well, then you have a big problem. How do you hook them into exploring your dungeon without railroading? You can't. I mean, you could, put a gun to their head or put a gun, you could say you got to go save the princess, but now you've put this pressure on them that they have to go do this thing or else. So remember, the fundamental concept of D&D was based off of this idea that the players wanted to go into dungeons because dungeons is where the cool treasure was. It's where the gold was and the treasure that they needed, 1, to level up, and 2, so that they could get cool powers. They didn't have feats. They didn't have cool powers. They didn't have cool abilities. The only way that they got awesome, powerful, cool, fun, unique things was by going into the dungeon. Oh, you mean I can find a cloak that can let me walk through walls? I can find boots that will let me crawl on the ceiling? Like, that sounds awesome. That sounds fun. That sounds amazing and fantastical. I would love to experience that. What do I have to do to get this stuff? You have to go into the dungeon. And they're like, bet, I'm in. If that doesn't motivate your players, then no, dungeons are not a great, example. In my personal opinion. I mean, you could put like fetch quests or, save the hostage quests and all this other stuff, but now you've kind of, I think, you kind of give it's a bit of a poison pill. I think that you've kind of ruined it a little bit in a certain sense. But I mean, this was true for all the characters. They just did not have really any sort of new abilities. I mean, even like the wizard, they needed to go find spells. They weren't just like getting all these spells when they leveled up like we're used to nowadays. They had to go find them. They had to go find them in the dungeon. So it was a big part of the game was finding these elements and finding these stuff. Okay. Samsan asks, I was wondering how much game system plays a role in dungeon crawl. Like example, RuneQuest that is not really designed to do dungeon crawl. I think I've only seen one attempt in RuneQuest for dungeon crawl, Snake Pipe Hollow. Man, did we suffer trying to conquer that place. Or a system like Forged in the Dark. How much would the system change your approach on a mega dungeon or regular dungeon? Huge. Huge. Absolutely huge. System, as Ben says, system is setting. And the type of system that you have makes a big impact on the type of things and the way that the game is going to express itself in a dungeon. There's no doubt about this. And, that you need to do some serious thinking and some serious potentially, rejiggering with some of the modern games like Pathfinder 2 and maybe even to a lesser extent D&D 5th edition. I think you have to change Pathfinder 2 more to make it work for a dungeon or a mega dungeon than you do 5th edition D&D. But that being said, there is a huge change to the way that the game system works, because you need to have that sense of resource depletion. You need to have that sense of the need to explore, to find cool treasure, weird abilities. There has to be some sort of pressing reason for your character to sort of explore this space. And I should also point out that like games like D&D are really well designed for this. There's a reason why D&D has spells like Tensor's Floating Disc and Pass Wall and Hold Portal. And I mean, there's like, I don't know, half the spells in D&D don't make any sense unless you think about exploring a dungeon. You're like, why would anyone ever want this spell? What does this spell do? It's like, this is a D&D spell. This is a dungeon spell. It's designed and to be used in a dungeon. Just full stop. And I don't know if it's like half. I mean, they've obviously changed, the game up considerably over the years, but for the most part, there's a ton of stuff in D&D. Bag of Holding, Jonas, absolutely. Bag of Holding, Rope of Climbing, right? All of these things are designed because, I mean, case in point, I'm doing my Torchbearer game, okay? And in Torchbearer, you have 3 torso slots that you can put stuff onto. So you can put like a cloak on your torso, you can put a quiver on your torso, and you can put a backpack on your torso. And a backpack takes up 2 torso slots. So 2 of the 3 slots are taken up by a backpack. And it gives you 6 slots to put items and equipment in. And everyone's like, geez, like, oh my God, like, can you imagine like what a bag of holding would be like in this system? Like, imagine having like a bag that had like 8 slots or 9 slots. That would be crazy. That would be amazing. That would be awesome. So yeah, bag of holding, portable hole, like all these weird magical items were just, and spells were because of D&D's existence in a dungeon. And it was a fun way to take something that used to be like a pain in the butt. Like, I don't think you understand like how much of a player you feel like until, the GM has this room. And again, this is where like the mindset is just totally toxic. The GM has this room. It's like a vault and there's a big key and you got to go find the key. And, your wizard's high enough level. You did it. You survived. And you just go pass wall. We just walk through the wall. You're changing the rules, and the first thing that GMs will say is like, that spell's terrible. It ruins dungeons. Everything's lined in lead. And that's horrible. That's horrible. The whole point of these crazy powerful spells is to give the players that sense of mastery, of being able to overcome challenges and problems in a way that they never could have before. And to be completely fair too, pass wall or spell like it is only a problem when the players can go back and rest and recover at will for free at any time. That's when it becomes a problem. So, let's see here. Yeah, I mean, I don't know that that's entirely wrong, Beowulf. I mean, I think it's better when the hooks are carrots. So many adventures are basically written as like, you have to go do this. It feels like a job. And who wants to fucking do that? Nobody. So I think that's where it's like, if the players are excited and they want to go on this adventure, not because they have to go on this adventure, I think that's way better. And, I think that, we call it a hook, right? Because it's designed to be something appealing that the players go, oh, I want to get that. And then you catch them with your dungeon and you reel them in. We're talking about like, these things most of these adventures aren't hooks. They're like nets, like we got you, bitch. And you didn't even want this. There's nothing for you here. You got trapped. You got stuck. You're trapped. And then the GM pulls the old like, well, I bought this adventure and I read it and you guys owe me this dungeon. And everyone goes, yeah, that's totally reasonable. Because it is a reasonable thing. But you're like, I don't want to be here. I don't care about this dungeon. And then what do you get players doing? How do we run this thing as quickly as possible? How do we get through this annoying thing so that we can finish it, so that we can move on to the next thing that the GM, the next thing in the adventure? And that's going to give you a terrible experience with your dungeons. So yeah, system matters a lot, and I think if you're talking about Pathfinder 2 or Dungeons and Dragons, you have to change it up considerably. That being said, you talk about Blades in the Dark. We just did Grimwild, and that's Blades in the Dark-esque, but it definitely has some strong elements there for dungeon exploration. So I think that that maybe there is some premise there too. I don't care about dungeons has been my experience with so many dungeons. And I'm willing to bet that that's been the experience for a lot of people as well. Ikamos says, I'd like to know, entertaining the assumption that doing so isn't futile, what are your thoughts on changing Pathfinder 2nd Edition for use in a mega dungeon campaign? The steep scaling is an issue. Is PF2E condemned to kill a dungeons at best? Well, the first thing is the steep scaling, you could use proficiency, what's it called? Proficiency without level is one option. And that will really smooth things out and give you a much less steep scaling issue. So there is that. I think if I was going to do some sort of really truly deep Pathfinder 2, I probably would want to use some sort of proficiency without level. That being said, the steep scaling is more of an issue within a level. Like, though, you don't want players to like level up really quickly before you've even like gotten halfway through the level. I think it could work with players leveling up to a certain extent, just with the understanding that, when they level up, you have to be prepared to let them go deeper, because the challenges of the fights that they're fighting are going to quickly drop off. But at the same time, you also have to understand that they really can't go that deeper. I don't know exactly what the range is. It depends on your party members, but I'm willing to bet that plus or minus 2 levels is about the best you're going to get, and probably more realistically plus or minus 1. That being said, that's not like the worst thing in the world, so I'm okay with that to a certain extent. You just have to be a little bit more careful and mindful about throwing some random, level 11 monster at your level 5 party. There's a certain component of D&D that you would be okay with that, actually, but not PF2. That would pretty much be an instant TPK. There'd be no chance for that. PF2E has little of that ever-increasing elastic force yanking the party back to town as they delve deeper. What to do? Healing surges. Wounded requires a longer rest to clear. Monsters that do drained, enfeebled, clumsy, fatigued until long rest. So there's this idea of death. There's a idea of encouraging a death spiral. Number one, I think one way you can do it is by introducing random encounters and not just letting them fully heal to full. And now a lot of people say, but aren't Pathfinder 2 encounters balanced around people being at full HP? And they are. But this means that you don't have to throw severes or extremes at your party. You could throw a moderate, and yeah, it's really easy, as most moderate encounters are. And they lose some hit points, but whatever. But if they can't be guaranteed that they're going to get 20 minutes to treat wounds back up to full, then when they go into that second fight and they're down some hit points, it may only be a moderate fight, but they're starting at 80% hit points or 75% hit points. And potentially you might be in a situation where you have to be comfortable with telling them this is an area where you really can't take or even just taking a single 10-minute rest is not guaranteed. So that's number one. Number two, I don't mind the idea of like wounded not being restored by treat wounds. Maybe wounded gets restored if you get healed back to full hit points. But I also don't mind the idea of wounded being something that does recover on a long rest. And that way, because the nice thing about wounded and the nice thing about doomed is they don't fuck the math up. The problem with the other statuses that you described, drained, enfeebled, clumsy, fatigued, is they fuck the math up. And then it really becomes a death spiral, because now the character, one of the beautiful things about D&D in some ways is that your hit points don't matter until they're gone. So it's scary, but it's also pointless. Like, it doesn't actually affect you, right? Your fighter is just as good at 1 hit point as they were at 30 or 40. And there's like a kind of an awesomeness in that, because it means that when you're in, there's almost a kind of a cool part of you where you're like, man, it'd be cool if like when you're below 10 HP, you kind of enter into a superhero mode. That'd be kind of cool too. PF2, if you start giving people drained and enfeebled and clumsy because of the tight math, now they become much more likely to fail those further encounters, which means that as players, your incentive is, okay, we need to get out of here. the mechanical pressure here is making me want to go recover and go rest. Why would we stay here? So you need to come up with some sort of carrot to encourage them, to keep going, even if they can't rest, even if you're stacking up wounded and it doesn't clear, even if for some reason you're doing drained, enfeebled, or clumsy. And unfortunately, some of the methodologies that we've talked about don't really apply in Pathfinder 2 because of the way that the math works. You can't really incite them with treasure and magical items because, these things are kind of assumed. You could only give experience points for treasure and not give it for the monsters. That is certainly an option. You could use a milestone-based experience, and maybe each level has, 2 or 3 critical key rooms that the party has to find. And each time they find one of these, it's worth, 335 experience points or something like that. And so if you find all 3, you level up or something like that, right? I'm just kind of thinking out loud here. But you could do it that way. But you need to give them something to strive for, because if you just get experience points from fighting monsters and there's no incentive to keep going when you get hurt, if you can just turn around and leave, then that is the problem. Now I want to take a quick side tangent to talk about Torchbearer again. One of the things that's nice about Torchbearer, and I think it does this better than any game I've ever seen, is town is expensive. It's very difficult for your character to sort of not be broke. So you always need money. And so if your characters went to the dungeon, fought a couple things, encountered a couple things, gained some conditions, and went back to town, which you couldn't do that more, because you would literally run out of money. It's just not feasible for your character to go fight something, go back to town, go fight something, go back to town. Secondly, this is kind of getting more old school, but going back to town does not, getting a full night's rest of 8 hours does not mean full hit points, all spells, no conditions, everybody's fine. It's like, it's like you were raised from the ashes as the Phoenix. Good night, Sam. Thanks for stopping by. Because if you go back to town in Torchbearer, if you go back to town and your character, Torchbearer doesn't have hit points, right? It has conditions. Your character goes back to town, and by the time you get back done with your adventure, your character is, angry, exhausted, and injured. And you get back to town and you spend some time there and you cash in the money that you earned and you spend some of your coin and, you try to use your gem that you found to try to pay for some repairs to your armor. And then when you leave town again, you haven't even cleared all those conditions. You might have only cleared one of them or 2 of them. You're like, yeah. I mean, I got rid of the angry and the exhaustion, but I'm still injured. I'm still got this cracked rib or this broken rib that is still fucking with me. Because it's just not like a reset button. And which is how, old school D&D, you recovered, I think it was a hit point per day in good conditions. So even just going I'll just go get a night's rest and then we'll go back to the dungeon, we'll be at full. It's like, that wasn't even an issue. Depending on the situation and the party or whatever like that, you might have to wait a week or 2 weeks. And especially if you get a higher level, it could be 3 or 4 weeks. It's just not something where you can just, hit the reset button. So hitting the reset button is kind of a big problem. And as I said before, when I played D&D 5th edition, I used the rule. Somebody knew it because, you guys are much better at 5th edition than me. Someone knew the name of the optional rule. I think grittier rests or something. When I played 5th edition, I used the rule that short rests were like an overnight camp, out in the wilderness. That was a short rest. And that a long rest was like a week or 2 in safety in town where there was no chance of random encounters. And I thought that did a great job of sort of stretching out, because even if the players, even if there was no mechanical penalty, even if you maybe you don't tell the players this outright, but even if they understand that we go into this dungeon, we fought 2 rooms, we turned around, we went back to town, and then we spent 2 weeks or a month in town taking a long rest, in a D&D 5e sense. Even if you weren't and guys, when you come back, you don't tell them this. You don't say, guys, when you come back, I'm not going to repopulate the entire dungeon. Even if you don't tell them that, I think as a group, as players, you instinctively go, oh, we can't take a month off. Like who knows what the dungeon will happen? Who knows what will happen to the monsters? Who knows what will happen to the treasure? Who knows what will happen to the goals and the objectives that we set? A month? That's crazy. We can't do that. We have to keep going. But when it's like one night, you're back, you leave, you grab a quick 8 hours, you come back the next day full, topped off, ready to kick ass. People go, yeah, that's fine. Even if there's no mechanical difference, I think asking people to like spend a month like freaks them out, and they like won't do it. Torchbearer is based on the Burning Wheel. It is, along with Mouse Guard, and they're all written by Luke Crane. Well, Luke Crane co-authored Torchbearer. Absolutely, Beowulf. It's absolutely like, you want a spaceship in Traveler because spaceships are cool and awesome, but your spaceship fucking costs a ton of money, and your spaceship costing you a ton of money is what keeps you having to go on wild, crazy Traveler spaceship adventures, because the very thing that you want is also the thing that is making you run out of money and become poor. So let's see here. The last thing Ikamos asks is, exploration mode is already halfway to an OSR procedure. What else would it need to emulate old school gameplay? In a word, random encounters. You need to make wasting time, taking time be more of a negative pressure. It doesn't, maybe it doesn't necessarily be monsters, but it just has to be something that drains them down. Pathfinder 2, unless you do a lot of heavy lifting, like you're not gonna be able to like put pressure people on lights or probably or food or anything like that. And so the only thing you can really pressure them on is the encounters themselves. Now the problem, and I understand this, the problem is, do you really want to have that many Pathfinder 2 fights? Maybe not. I don't, that's, because people talk about random encounters back in the day. Well, when you're playing first edition AD&D, or if you're playing Moldvay Basic, and I just go, you're going through the dungeons and, you guys are wasting time and you're exploring this section. I go, okay, it's been 20 minutes. I'm going to make a random encounter. Oh, roll the dice. 12 orcs come around the corridor as you guys are kind of debating about the map, and they look up at you, and I roll my reaction chart, and they snarl, they brandish their weapons, and they speak in crude common. You leave now, offer us tribute, or we stick you like pig. What do you do? And you're like, oh shit. And then you're like, yes, fuck these orcs. You're like, I go, enough talk. And I throw my dagger and I go, yeah, that's totally awesome. Of course you do. It's a surprise round. You totally get to throw your dagger. The lead orc is hit. The other orcs look stunned as the guy who issued the challenge, blood spurts out from his neck wound. They snarl, ignoring their fallen, comrade as they trample over him as they charge you. And then we roll a new initiative. And then like 10 minutes later, that fight is over. So there's something to be said about the fact that it was like really quick, hell, it might even be less than that, right? Like we could go around that first combat, the players win initiative, the orcs are charging in, boom, one gets dropped by an arrow, boom, another one gets hit by a magic missile. Then when they close in, the dwarf and the fighter go, shoulder to shoulder, and they're hacking and hewing, and they both take down two, and you're using the mighty cleaving optional rule from Dave Arneson, and you take down a second one, and then I roll the orcs morale, and they break, and they go running away. And like that whole sequence, this big montage sequence, was less than a round of combat, and it maybe only took 5 minutes at the combat table. But you had this really cool moment, and it was really dangerous, and it was really scary. Everybody was really nervous for about 2 minutes, and then it was over, and then you can move on your life. You wouldn't even have been done finding the minis, or even if you were using a VTT, the tokens to drag them from the actor library onto the canvas before that, other fight was over. So that is an advantage that games like Shadow Dark and things like that do have. And Pathfinder 2 can be, can take a while to resolve some of these fights. So that could be a negative against it. I would certainly say that Pathfinder 2 would not be my immediate go-to for a mega dungeon, deep dungeon campaign. I just wouldn't. I think the system is more set up for big heroic adventures where the characters kind of just keep going, and it's more for Avengers. And believe it or not, 5e I think does a better job. I know that people go, oh, 5e is so busted and you can break your characters so ridiculously. Obviously I suck at 5e. I don't know all the different ways that you can break your character. I understand that the rules aren't that so tight, but I don't know. Be a man, be a woman, slap your players around and say, don't do that. You know, don't be a jerk. Like, don't take that stupid, dumb, crazy ability, and then let's actually have some fun. Real quick, Tommy, do you give the players a dungeon map? No, I do not. I think it kind of ruins the point of exploration, right? If they know where everything is, I don't need them to hit every single thing. I don't want them to hit every single thing. I want them to sort of explore and learn the dungeon to a certain extent. What I will say, Tommy, okay, this is a side note here for Tommy, is I don't give the players a map, but I definitely make sure they know stuff about that dungeon. If it's a brand new campaign, they start off with rumors or a scrap of a map, or they have a piece of an amulet that their father gave to them that he said unlocks a great treasure in the dungeon. Follow the golden statue, or something. You have to give them some texture. If the dungeon to the players at the start is just a blank sheet of paper and they have no context, there's no texture to it at all. They have no idea what they could be looking for or why they would even want to be here, other than we heard there's treasure. That's no bueno. You have to have given them something that they can sort of make decisions based off of, and give them something that they're hoping to find or they're looking out for. That is so huge. Like, spoiler alert, like the first dungeon that I've made for the Torture Bearers, outside of anything else, the players will have heard the legend of this great evil horned god statue with two giant ruby eyes that is in this dungeon. And, right off the bat, there's going to be players who go, I want that. I want to get both. And, you understand at a fundamental level that if you're going towards a place and you're like, oh, this way looks like it doesn't lead to an evil god temple. This way does look like it leads to an, evil god temple. We're going to go that way because I want the evil god. I want the evil god statue. I want the ruby eyes. And if you're like, Derek, that sounds awfully familiar, it's literally inspired by the Player's Handbook cover. Anyways, moving on here. GeoRock44, what's your method for doing a dungeon crawl on a VTT with a map and keeping the PCs from wandering around? I think I already described this, but basically I would not use the VTT for the moving around the dungeon and exploring things. I would literally only have scenes for specific combats that I thought were going to happen. And then I would only use the PCs on a map at that time. Otherwise, I would just use a generic scene. If you want to pull in some fun art assets or something that you made on AI or you found on DeviantArt or something, or you stole from some WotC book or something, that's fine. But I would not let the players move their pieces around like we're playing a game of Clue on the VTT map. I think that kind of defeats the whole purpose. I ideally want kind of almost a blank page. Maybe, like I said, a piece of art isn't the worst thing in the world if it's kind of generic and nondescript. And, I just want us to be describing. I want us to be having a conversation. I don't want people to be playing, a board game. It's bad enough that we have to do that when we're in combat. I get that it's a necessity for some people. I get that it's a necessity for some systems that really care about your positioning, but we don't need it outside of that. And I'd rather we didn't do that. So Darth Gorlock, we're almost through these questions. Great. Darth Gorlock asks, how engaging should the wilderness be between town and the dungeon? Should it just be a quick 5 minutes deadly thing, or should you not have that for a mega dungeon? Great question. My answer is, for a mega dungeon, I would have it be minimal at best, because the mega dungeon itself should and will act as the sort of wilderness to a certain extent. Because if you have the mega dungeon, here, let me get another thing here. Okay. So if you have, this is the surface, and here's town, And then, a short jaunt away is the ancient ruins. And then below that is the levels of the dungeon. Then by the time the group, and I don't think you should shortcut this. This is the key that I was kind of talking about here, is that when the group goes to enter this dungeon and they leave town and then they want to get down to here, well, then I want them to have to go through the dungeon and to get to here. And while they're making their way through the dungeon, I want them to have potentially random encounters. And those random encounters should be, hopefully we're playing in a game system where, they don't tax a lot of their resources, but, they started off at 100% and now, they're getting slowly ticked down by these pointless resources that they don't want. And I should really point out that at a certain point, like when we played our game, so this was like level 1 and this is level 2. Eventually, like in my one dungeon, the group got down, not level 7. The group got down to level 7. So, imagine there's a lot more intervening between here and here. That's a lot of walking to do. But by that point in time, they found level 7 first and they kind of had to experience that hardship. But eventually on level 1, they re-blessed this temple to a goddess. And then down on level 7, they found one of her shrines and they reconsecrated that shrine. And that actually created a magical teleporter between the two shrines. And so now they could leave town, go into level 1, and they're level 7. So most of the stuff on level 1 is not even remotely a threat anymore. And then boom, beam down to level 7. And that felt like that was like, that was awesome for them. And they felt like they earned that. They felt like they, sort of made that part of their, that felt like a win for them. It's just the same way that like getting past wall and being able to pass through walls, it feels like a win for the characters. So, I would not have that for a mega dungeon, Darth. I think because the whole point of the mega dungeon is we want our game to be predominantly focused on the dungeon, the factions of the dungeons, the random encounters of the factions. And for the most part, we're kind of ignoring the overworld. And we really want to focus on the dungeon. Now, if we're talking about a broader game that has to deal with more overland stuff, hex crawl type environments or wilderness point crawls, that's a little different because now we want to sort of expand the scope of the campaign from just this sort of one dungeon to the wider world and include some of these more, geographically ranging factions and locations and things of that nature. And that's where I think that can be really helpful and beneficial. But for a mega dungeon, I would avoid it. Okay. Couple more. Shadram asked, I'd be keen to go a bit deeper on the reward system you spoke about on the previous stream, giving XP for discoveries and magic items. What would a solid example of this look like in PF2, for example? I'm planning a dungeon-focused PF2 sandbox campaign, and I really want to get away from rewarding XP only for fighting, so this really appeals to me. Any good resources? Okay, so let's do this. Let's talk about that. So what I would do, I mean, you could do this however you want, but this is the quickest and easiest way that comes to my mind. So number 1 is you make leveling up. You don't change anything about the monsters. You make leveling up take 3,000 XP. Okay? So if you go and you fight a moderate fight, it's worth 80. If you go and fight a severe fight of your level or whatever, it's 120, just like before. But whereas before you were trying to get to 1,000, now you got to get to 3,000. So if you're just fighting monsters, okay, this is going to take a very long time. So combat can still be part of your reward cycle. But what you can also give experience for is the other things that you want to encourage. Like, for example, perhaps treasure. We know that items have an effective level in Pathfinder 2. So if the group finds, let's just assume they're level 1 or something like that. But if they find a level 1 item, well, we know a level 1 creature is worth 40 XP. We know that a level 2 creature would be worth 60 XP. So we can award XP for the magic items that they found. And we can do an equivalent thing by kind of looking at the GP value for gold or the similar or the like found. So we can do that. Additionally, we could reward them for discovery. We already said that a level 1 monster, when you're level 1, is worth 40 XP. 2 level 1 monsters against a party of 4 people would be 80 experience points, which is why that's moderate. 3 would be severe, and 4 would be extreme. That'd be 160. Well, we could come up with a similar anecdote. We could award 40 XP for every room that they discover. Every new room that they add to their map or every new room that they find. We could award, 60 XP or maybe 80 XP for finding, a new entrance or finding stairs or finding a secret door or any sort of special room. So now our players get experience points for finding treasure, leveling up, finding treasure, exploring the map, doing. Now, when I played as well, I gave them a 50% bonus to the discovery experience points if they kept some kind of map. I gave them a further 50% bonus on the discovery if they kept some sort of log. So if they kept the log and a map, they got ×2 the discovery XP as a party. And then the last area that you could potentially put in is, like I said before, is this idea of lore. If you have these sort of, key secrets or pieces of lore that are part of your dungeon, and you're sort of, revealing them as like a layer of like an onion, then every time the players uncover another piece of that lore, you could give them experience points. Encourage them to investigate and to learn and to find out bits of information. Award that with experience points. So yes, on paper, they need a lot more experience points to go up. They need 3,000 experience points. And if they're just doing that through fighting alone, it's going to take them a long time. But if you award them for treasure, if you award them for lore, if you award them for discovery or exploration, suddenly they're actually in a situation where if the players are fighting and getting treasure and learning the lore and discovering, they actually might level up potentially maybe faster, because they're actually doing it all. So this way, you haven't actually made experience for fighting monsters less. You've just made them need more. Have I checked out Arden Vol? Yes, I own it. I've owned the maps for a very long time. I bought the maps before I ever bought the actual adventure. I waited till the adventure was on sale because it was kind of pricey. I own it in PDF. I don't own it in print. Yeah, I mean, published mega dungeons can be real hit or miss. I do not have enough experience with Arden Vol to say whether it is hit or miss. I'll say that. Okay, so that's Shadram. Any good resources for building or generating a dungeon or sources of inspiration? For me, I always fall back to my Tome of Adventure Design. As I've talked about before, I love the Tome of Adventure Design. I think it's a very good resource for me. You can also rely on, there's this, but again, I encourage people. I think the biggest, and the reason why I say there's a lot of people for dungeon resources will give you random encounters or random generators. The thing that I really like about the Tome of Adventure Design, is I don't think you should be using the random generator to, hey, there's a room, roll on it. It has an altar and it has some snakes. All right, next room. It has if you're doing that, you're just generating random nonsense. Like, it's a great idea to give you inspiration, and you should be connecting those dots, and so that's the only thing I say about that is make sure you're not just, using these random idea inspirers, these oracle tables, these generators, and then just throwing a bunch of random stuff together, Discovery XP seems problematic if it doesn't require engaging with the content of each room. Why? Why does it seem problematic? I'm just curious why you think that seems problematic. Like, I don't need them to beat the room. Heck, if the room has a monster and they leave it alone, they're leaving experience behind. If the room had treasure and they're leaving the treasure behind, they're leaving experience points behind. If the room had lore and things to be discovered, if they interacted with it and poked and prodded with it, then, they're leaving experience points behind. And just like fighting all the fights and never doing any of the other stuff it's going to take you a long time to level up. If you're only, I don't know, exploring doors and closing them or something, then it's going to take you a very long time to level up. I think you'll get bored of it before anything else. Now that Daniel, how does Discovery Expert intersect Discovery Expert with point crawl transition? Same thing. That's all. Just, I'm imagining that if you're talking about like a mega dungeon, right, your point crawl is still going to look pretty large. It's going to have, 20 or 30 different nodes on one level, maybe. And so, you can just assign an XP value to each of those nodes. That's all. And of course, obviously, that you can get more procedural if you want. When you talk about point crawls, we didn't really get into this, but like you could have a procedure that like anytime you travel between nodes, there's a random encounter. And maybe your dungeon is divided into different areas. So like, I'm just spitballing here. All right. So like real quick, like, you got your entrance. I'm just going to literally just draw a ton of different. Pay no attention to whether this is actually good or not. And so like you could have a series of dungeons where the dungeon encounter goes in very different directions, and as a result, each of these transitions can represent a different part of the dungeon and different areas, and you could just assign an XP value to all of them. But then what you could say is that, okay, the transition, the red transitions, these are the areas controlled by the Red Orc clan, and they use the red encounter table. And every time you travel between nodes, you roll on the red encounter table. And then, over here, these are the crypts. And, they're all kind of branching off of this central crypt area here. And, maybe this transition doesn't have random encounters. Maybe that one's so off the beaten path, there is nothing there. But this is the crypt area. And maybe this is the yellow encounter table. And the players learn to fear the yellow encounter table because it's got all sorts of scary undead on there that like drain ability scores or, do all sorts of gross stuff. But if the players, and I'm just like totally making this up now, but like if the players manage to go to each of the 5 satellite tombs and they find the 5 urns that represent the 5, things, and then they bring the 5 urns back to the central crypt and they, put the undead king to rest, then maybe, right, the yellow encounter table, for all intents and purposes, goes away. And now there aren't undead nemesis on these encounter charts. Now it's, more open and the undead have been cleaned. But then when the players go back and they go, this is awesome. And maybe they, let them enjoy it. Let them enjoy it for a little while. But then if they go back to town for a long time, or if they take their sweet, time, then by the time they come back, maybe now, right, the red orcs who they had ignored have expanded. And now, they let them be. And now the orcs have doubled down, and maybe an ogre has come in, or, like a stone giant has come in and has taken over leadership. And, you could make the dungeon dynamic. And I wouldn't, like I said, yeah, like it'd be cool that you should totally give them their prize. Don't just steal it from them immediately. But at the same time, do not be afraid. This is your chance. How players get to, the players level up and then they get to go home and they get to look through books and they get to decide what feat they're going to take and how their character's going to grow and change. Well, the dungeon is like your character sheet. It's going to grow and change as the players interact with it and as the players do stuff to it, and so we got our red encounter table with the orcs. We got our yellow encounter table with the the undead king. And then, we could put something else down here. And, obviously this is an area of much gnashing of teeth because maybe this is another tribe of humanoids or something like that. These are the goblins or kobolds, right? Sam, would you still roll on an encounter table if the connection had a lock or a one-way door? I mean, it depends on what these node connections actually represent. This line here could represent, this connection right here could represent, if we were to draw the map, if we were to like zoom in on that map, that one connection might look like, it's like a long corridor here, and then there's a branching over here, and it goes to this way, and then there's a door here that opens up there, and then this comes this way and branches this way, and there's another T section, and this goes into a room here, and this over here, and then this comes up there, and here, and here, and here, and here, and then this opens up into a room here, and there's a big room here, and none of these rooms really have anything particularly, interesting from our standpoint. We are just kind of abstracting the players moving, through this path between nodes. So to say that the door is locked, it doesn't make as much sense. It's not like that node connection literally represents a single hallway that if the players are walking down and ends in a locked door. That being said, that's another area. Well, this is getting more into like weird node-based dungeon design, but like one thing that you can kind of do is you can have this idea that like if a connection between zones represents something like a series, like a large area of twisting passages and stuff like that, maybe the players have to make a check, and there's a chance that they end up in this room, but if they like fail the check, they end up in this room, right? So this is kind of almost like a special room or like a special area that you can only access. You don't really know it's there. You just access it on accident. Maybe this is like where a giant spider lairs is. You don't want to find it. It's almost like a random encounter, but it's like a random room.
Thanks for answering our questions, Derek. This discussion has been enlightening and inspirational, as usual.
Thank you, Shadram. Appreciate the shout out. Appreciate the tip. I'm glad you're finding it useful. And of course, Shadram, like a lot of these, all the people that I've been reading tonight, these are members of the Knights of the Last Call Patreon, so they can ping me whenever they want. You may find it amazing to believe, but unlike a lot of YouTube creators, I'm on my Patreon Discord all the time, and everybody can ping me and ask me questions about their game. So if anybody's building a dungeon on the Knights and you want my thoughts or input, just let me know. I think it'd be kind of cool to kind of like, remember Dungeon 23, and I don't know if they tried to do Dungeon 24, but people had different success with it. I got to like room 9 or 10 and I ran out of steam, but it would be kind of cool. I wonder if like, it'd be kind of cool to do like Dungeon KOLC, not Dungeon 23, not Dungeon 25, Dungeon KOLC, and like kind of give everybody like a room to design and then like, get together and kind of share it and kind of critique your work in it, like not in a, mean way, but like in a growth creative way. I think that'd be pretty cool to do. Thank you, Chandra. All right, let me finish up these questions from my patrons. What do dungeon monsters do in their free time? They try to survive. I mean, if they're humanoid monsters, they do what any humanoids do. They pass the time, they try to live their life or whatever. And if they're like a bestial monster, most of them are probably pretty low intelligence. They're probably just like a predator. They conserve their energy and then they try to hunt and try to feed. Sarak says, where do you find fun as a GM in dungeon crawling? As a GM that really loves some solid FBT now and then, do I lean on factions and interactions that aren't always in combat? Absolutely. I'm not even going to lie. Some of the most incredible role-playing that people, I'm going to use your term, you, the generic YouTube audience, right? I consider the whole thing role-playing. I've had some of the best social encounters that involve role-playing, from surprise results from a reaction table. I've seen now there's like a really good one, which is, and I don't know where I first saw this, but I've seen it published a couple different places now, which is 2 tables. One is like, what does this group of monsters want? Or what does this group of creatures want? And then the second axis is like, and what is their general reaction? And I think like just those two things on the spot, you as a GM, you suddenly have to be like, you suddenly realize the goblins want help and they're coming in, they're afraid and they're cautious, but the adventurers are this powerful force. And maybe the goblins need their help and they're willing to share information or give them the big ruby or whatever, and suddenly you're role playing, you're talking in character, you're having a social encounter in the dungeon. And this is even better, I think, nowadays because we've kind of gotten away from alignment, to a world where ideally there is no alignment. And everybody's just kind of doing their own thing, which isn't to say that there aren't bad guys, but like back in the day, it was kind of like, well, these are goblins. They are evil. Like we should be killing them. So there was a certain kind of weird tension there. I'm a good character. They're evil. I should be killing them. But now that we've kind of moved away from alignments for the most part, you get a lot more freedom to not necessarily feel like you're literally dealing with a group of, serial killing, murdering rapists. Instead, they're just goblins. They're probably not good guys, but the enemy of my enemy is maybe my friend, and maybe it's a temporary alliance, and maybe I'm not as morally bright, and maybe I have a little bit of streaks of gray in me and myself. So I think that's a lot. I think that's really interesting. So that's where I find the fun. And then for me, I find the fun just going like, I've set up this environment, and I get to see what my players do with it and have fun reacting to them. I want to be reacting as much as possible in any game master situation. I never want to be like, I always want to be saying, oh, the players just did something. It's my job to react. It's my job to react. They're the protagonists. They're the ones that are supposed to be taking the action. They're the ones that are supposed to be driving the story forward. So no, I don't think you have to stay out of Mega Dungeons at all. I think factions can sometimes be neutral aligned or good aligned. Imagine if down on level 2, there's a colony of dwarves who've come here seeking the rich veins of mithril that are said to lie in the caverns on level 3. They've established a base camp and they're barely holding their own. And then you're like, okay, well, these dwarves kind of don't want us here because they would rather just be left alone and mine the mithril. But at the same time, they also understand that we potentially could be very strong allies, but they're kind of greedy, but they're not bad guys by any stretch of the imagination. So you could absolutely have all sorts of different factions. It doesn't have to necessarily just be different monstrous factions. So I think you can have a good time with that. DM Rawling says, how do you decorate a dungeon to make it feel distinct and interesting for players as they go through it? Well, I think like anything, I think you can overdo it. I would say that it's, for me, like if it's an important room, it's cool to give it one thing that really stands out. Basically, one unique thing about that room that no other room has. If it's just another room that's 30 by 50 and has some pillars, it's going to be really difficult for anybody to make, stay pace for that. That being said, other than that, 2 to 3 bullet points, one of them being the kind of unique thing, and then a little bit of, window dressing, hit some of the other senses. And I think that's all you really need. But a cool room with a distinctive trait and then a great series of encounters or challenges in a room is all you usually need for people to remember. And they're going to remember it on their own condition and volition anyways. You can lead a horse to water, but you can't make them drink. So the best thing that you can do is give them something that is going to stick out in their mind. And again, lean into the fantastic. We were joking around about the big hand room, but like, yeah, that'd be cool. I don't know. You go into a room and it's like, it looks kind of like a normal room, but then in the center of the room, there's a hand, a humanoid-like hand, but it's giant in stature, ripping up through the cobblestone ground. And then as you look, you realize it's made out of stone too, but it's incredibly lifelike. And you're like, what the fuck is this? Oh, it's memorable, and then, then that actually, well, that's like a whole separate different thing, but here, we'll quickly jump over here. One of my favorite things to do is to give multi-level landmarks. Okay. So, oh, that's not what I want. I want this one. So like here's our surface, right? And then here's level 1 of our dungeon. And here's level 2 of our dungeon. And here's level 3 of the dungeon. And here's level 4 of the dungeon. And, so on and so forth. And then what you end up doing, right, is like you're like, you've got the hand here. And then like when the party comes to like level 2, there's a chamber and you're like, there's a very strange pillar, and you realize it's the creature's arm, you know? And then you get down to like this level and like, you know, you see its face, you know, it maybe at this edge of the level, you just see this massive half of a face sticking out of a part of the wall. And then as you get to lower levels, you know, you find its chest or its heart or, you know, or something like that. And then you keep going deeper and deeper, you know, something like that. Like that's like one of those things that like anchors you in space as you go through. And it's kind of like a fun Easter egg, like a callback or a shout out to, you know, these other things. Oh God, it's a mouth. Yeah. Like that's, you know, like, and at first maybe the players see the hand, they don't think anything of it. It's not until they get to level 2 and then they realize that this is an arm. And when, even though it seems dead simple, remember I've said this before, players, you know, you as a GM, you've written this yourself. You've prepped it yourself. You've thought of it yourself. You read it in a book, some adventure. You've seen all the cool art. And as a result, everything makes total sense to you. But I've told you this before. You could tell players straight up, like, what's going on, and they still won't get it because they are looking at the world through such a limited visor, because it's just literally the words that are coming out of your bumbling mouth. And I say that lovingly because I bumble, I ramble, I don't always make sense either when I'm GMing. And you know, it's not always just dead simple. And you might have this big hand, and then when the players get down to level 2 and they see this strange thing, and then that moment where someone goes, oh, it's an arm. Oh, it's the arm of the hand. This is like a giant petrified guy. Everyone's gonna be like, oh my God, that's amazing, you know? And having that fun little moment of discovery, because then now that asks a question. Like, what is this thing? Why is it here? And if you do have an answer for that, even if it's not tied into like the future of your campaign, maybe it's just some random event that happened. Maybe there was some great Titan that, you know, I don't know, his teleport spell his plane shift spell went ado and he got teleported into solid rock here. But as long as there's like some story behind it, you know, I think that's where you can kind of build up and have this fun moment, you know, and I think that's what's so important about it. And you know what, Shadram? If the PCs called it the nipple level and the groin level, I would pat myself on the back, because it means they are interfacing with the game on its level. And it would be a fun inside joke with the players, and it would bring them together in a way that I think you may not appreciate without, you know, I know you're kind of being like, maybe you're kind of joking, but I actually think that stuff like that is what binds groups together, because that means nothing to anybody else. But to your small group of players, everyone nods their head. They go, yeah, nipple level. And you're like, oh, what the hell are you talking about? You're like, yeah, nipple level. And it means something to you, and that's cool. What are the best examples of published dungeons? Well, I am a sucker for the Caves of Chaos. B2, I think, is probably one of the best designed dungeons. It's not a mega dungeon by any stretch of the imagination, but B2, Keep on the Borderlands, the Caves of Chaos is, to my mind, a top-notch example of a dungeon. The Caverns of Thracia by Janelle Jacquez is also quite good. Which else is good here? I mean, some of these are classic. I'm trying to think of more modern ones. I don't know. Those are the two that just came to the top of my mind. Caverns of Thracia, Keep on the Borderlands. Forge of Fury. I think Forge of Fury is really good. That was a 3rd edition adventure, but it got published in one of the, I think it got published in Tales of the Yawning Portal. El Cobb is quite good. Lost City of Baracus is quite good as well. I didn't mention that because not many people are going to know Necromancer Games modules, but I actually think I own 2 copies of Baracus. I think. I don't know where they are. I think I own one for 3rd edition and I own one for PF1. Lost City of Baracus is incredible. Not only does it include a campaign, not only does it include a city, it includes a wilderness area. It's got a whole thing. Am I going to mention Rapanathuk? No, because I think that it's too much. It's got a lot of filler. in some places, and some of it is just like deadly to be deadly. Some of it is a little bit too like, we're so evil, and we're so grim, and we're so, horrifying, and we're so terrible. And that's fun to a certain type of group, but I think Rapanathuk misses some of the fun and magical mystery element of Mega Dungeons, and really digs more into like the grim grinder Tomb of Horrors style. And that's fun for a little while. And I've owned Rapanathuk for a very long time. In fact, I own Rapanathuk 4 different ways, from the original Necromancer modules to the Rapanathuk Reloaded box set, to the big, thick, fat Pathfinder 1 red cover, and the 5e. And we've never really played through it, because at a certain point, while we have great stories and fun stories, eventually, that kind of grindhouse dungeon, you just get burned out on it, and rightfully so. I just don't think it's as fun for me. Maybe it is for you, but it is for me. Pillars of Eternity, is that a RPG? Has a mega dungeon wrapped around the giant Arda statue just like this. I don't know if anybody mentioned that. No, I don't know what that is. The game also has a developer comment. Oh, it must be a video game, where you get periodic voiceovers about how they made the game, and the dungeon design device is actually really solid. Oh, that sounds pretty cool. Yeah, I think, I don't know all the DCC adventures, so I can't comment on them, but I do think that, they saw the deadliness of OSR games and they went, yes. Now, to be fair, Rapanathuk, when it came out in 3rd edition, like that had been his dungeon since like the 80s. He just decided to make a game company and publish it. So he'd been doing that since the 80s. So I can't blame him for, their whole thing, Necromancer Games, was, what was it? New school rules, old school feel, I think was their tagline, right? So they were trying to go for that. But even then, I have not. I've kind of stayed away from Barrow Maze a bit. Like I said, there have been a lot that have come out in the last 10, 20 years. But there've been some game like which one? Like Slumbering Sar Saga wasn't that great. I didn't think Dwemer Mount wasn't that great. There's just been some misses. So, to that end. What are your Jacob Wojo says, what are some of your favorite rooms that you always put in a dungeon? Well, Jacob, I'm going to answer this in more of like less of like a room that I add to a dungeon, but it's something that I always do when I have a dungeon. So one of the things I always do is, if I have a multi-level dungeon, I always include I'll call it a bonus puzzle. Booth B.
Tip $10. I've enjoyed this series of videos, even though I prefer the one and dungeon to the mega variety.
That's fine. I think maybe not a one and done, but like I think a 1, 2, or 3 are done dungeon is totally valid, and I think could be a lot of fun, because then you get you can really mix it up and you can have a lot of different experiences, and I think that's really fun. That episodic dungeon nature is kind of like where the game kind of started. So I think that's awesome, and I'm glad you enjoy it. But yeah, I don't think there's anything wrong. Mega dungeons are cool, but they're not for everyone. They're not even always for me. Sometimes I would much rather have that sense of scale that you get when you've got some, you got some cool, land that the group is exploring, and and they start down here, and then they explored, the crypt of the betrayer, and then they made their way up north to the mountain holdfast of the dwarves, and then they went into the great forge and they routed out the orcs there, and then you made your way down to the coast, and then you went into the forbidden island and found your way to the temple ruins there and fought Medusas, and then you have this kind of cool sense of exploring a space and sort of, you know, finding around there. So I really like that. And I think that could be really quite effective. So I always include like a bonus puzzle. And when I say puzzle, I mean like puzzle. I mean, like, I'm going to throw it down and it's for the players to figure out, take it or leave it. But generally speaking, like I said, it's a bonus puzzle. It's a side room. It usually leads to some sort of bonus treasure or maybe like a weird bit of lore or a strange magical effect. It's some sort of like little bonus that, hey, if you can solve this puzzle, then you get you can, and sometimes there's clues and hints throughout the dungeon level. Or sometimes there's things that you need to acquire on the dungeon level or maybe even across multiple dungeon levels. But it's optional, but I always love to include, and like my players who enjoy puzzles, and I have some of them don't. And when they find one of these, everyone knows that they don't have to go through it. And I usually have it as like a handout because I can basically just hand it to the 2 players that actually really care about it. And the rest of the players kind of keep playing. And they're like, we'll come back to it later. They don't need to go that way. And they could come back next session. It's fine. They can work on it. Hell, they can work on it between the sessions. I don't care. I'm just putting it there because it's fun for them and it's fun for me. I like puzzles. I used to do the puzzle hunt. As I've talked about this before at Gen Con. I used to basically spend half of my time at Gen Con like doing the puzzle hunt. And, I even almost won a couple years and I enjoy, kind of that Ron Swanson. I like puzzles. I don't really like word jumbles. I'm pretty bad at those, but, anyways, I was just remembering Django to get to the next room. I mean, not quite Django to get to the next room. I mean, I never got this level because I didn't have the money back then, but now I probably would, where like I would totally like buy one of those like puzzle boxes, they're like $50-$60 and just be like, and put it down and be like, you guys can mess around with that, whatever you want, and then if you get it open and you get to the thing inside, great. I put a secret password in the middle of it. And if you get to that'll help you out with something in the game. Totally optional. So I always include like a bonus puzzle that I let people mess with. Number 2, and I've talked about this before, I almost always include, and this is on every level. And the reason I do this is because I want my players to have that context to go, all right, new level. Cool. We know what to go. I want to find the puzzle on this level. I want to find the fountain. And it doesn't always come in the form of a magical fountain, but if you go back to old school AD&D first edition, Gary Gygax had these random fountain tables in his book. And then even like Might and Magic, Clouds of Zine, there would be these magic fountains who would drink, and it would just like give you random stat buffs and bonuses and boosts. Well, it got to the point in my games where like usually it's a D100 chart of just random, different, crazy, abilities. And it's random roll. No one knows what to expect. I think usually higher is better. There's nothing like bad on it. So fountains of save and reload. Well, but that's what makes it even more fun, Boothby, is that you can't save and reload. In fact, one of the most famous fountains were in Diablo 1. Perfect. Yeah, shrines. It's same idea. One of the most famous fountain incidents happened was we were playing, almost all of mine are permanent effects. Almost all of mine. Sometimes, and it's very rarely ever like, this is stupid. Like you can cast butterfly wings. Like sometimes it might be kind of pointless and ridiculous. Like, you can permanently manifest a tensor's floating disk. I don't know what you're going to do with that. Go have fun with that, Now, to be clear, George, that was Smith's table, not my table. I didn't make you. Oh, no, I did make you a purple cavalier. Did I make you a purple cavalier or did Smith make you a purple cavalier? I think it was Smith. But one of my favorite incidents that ever happened was we were playing a dungeon and I don't exactly remember how or why, but like somebody had made a new character and this is from 3rd edition. Their race was called Feral Gargoon. And I don't actually know if this is a real race or not. Let me take a look at 3E Feral Gargoon. Is this the thing? Hell yeah, it is a thing. Okay. So it's from Races of Stone. So that tells us everything that we need to know. It's from Races of Stone. And this monster could function as it was a 2-hit die, racial hit die. So it was probably like an ECL 3 or 4. It had a level 2 adjustment. So it was an ECL 4. So for whatever reason, the characters were high enough level. He got to make this feral Gargoon, like barbarian. He rolled really well on his stats. Okay. And he went through the dungeon and just got incredible. By the way, this is Rich, our buddy who is in chat sometimes as SC Voldo. And he got like the best results on a table. And like everyone was like, oh my God, dude, you're going to do it. You're going to break it. So they were like on level 7 of the dungeon. This character was so powerful. And we were at Smith's basement. I remember this. And Rich drinks from a fountain and we roll randomly. And he rolled like really low. He rolled like a 1 or something. And it was like, you lose you don't get anything and you lose all the other previous fountain results. And it was like, it was like someone's dog died because everyone was just like, oh my God, whatever. And then like, and Rich was sitting here just like, and the thing is, his character was still totally broken. He had great stats. And I don't even remember how he convinced me to let him play this powerful race, which had like broken abilities. And everyone looks over and Rich he just like in a moment of like a cobra, like a viper, right? He just suddenly snatches up his character sheet from, it's on the ground. And I'm sitting here telling him, and he's kind of looking and he just like grabs his character sheet. And like, everyone's like, no. And like Smith's like, and I'm like, Rich, what are you doing? Smith's like, Rich, don't do it. Rich, don't do it. He's like, he just rips his character in half. He just says, I don't even want to be it anymore. Like losing the fountain abilities was the end for him. He's like, I can't go back to sleep. Yes. Hey, look at that. The man, the myth, the legend is here himself. Yeah, that's right. George became the Old Spice guy. I became a noble gnome with purple hair, and Matt always won initiative. That's correct. Yes. Although, was that because of a fountain that he became the Old Spice guy? I don't remember that. I do remember that George was supposed to be the noble, but then he got like purple faced, and then I got randomly rolled. And maybe it was like it was something. But anyways. Yes, it was exactly at that speed. It was this like slow motion, like, and it was this amazing moment. It was fantastic. Had a friend named Rich who almost did the same thing when his ranger was blinded. My character could cure blind. That's such a good story. Right. That's the most important thing, is that George's cavalier could say, now I'm on a horse. Look over there. Look back at me. It's diamonds. And he could turn his all of our treasure into equivalent GP diamonds. It was very nice. It was very convenient. Needless to say, not all of our campaigns are that super serious. It goes without saying. So anyways, Jacob, I always try to put these weird, fun, wacky, quirky, fantastic fountains in my campaign. And again, they're not always literally fountains. And this is something I do. It's something that Smith does. We're sort of inspired, like I said, by classic computer role-playing games like Might and Magic for me, Ultima, but it's also part of like that AD&D fountain, kind of mindset. And it's fun because if your players know they're there, they're going to want to find them. Remember, like I said, the whole point of the dungeon is to get people excited to explore it. You want your players to find it. And full disclosure, one of the things that really it drives people is this ability to be like, hey, cool, this is some power, this is some ability, this is something I've gained, not because the game told me that I needed to get this powerful ability, but because I played, because I was here, because I got to do this thing, because I participated in the session. That to me is more meaningful on my character sheet than some feat that the game gave me because I just said level 10. And while I enjoy crunch, it's paradoxically, I get bored with OSR games because there's no elements to your character. But paradoxically, gaining these level-based abilities, and that's why, when I start playing OSR, I get bored because I go, man, I'm like level 2 or 3 and I haven't gained anything. And then, and then I get bored. But then when I play like Pathfinder 2 or I play whatever, D&D, the opposite problem happens. I'm like, oh, cool, look at all these cool abilities. And then by the time like I'm level 6 or level 8, I kind of like, I don't even care about all these feats anymore. Like I have enough, and maybe that's why like 3rd edition always kind of fills that right spot, because you get some stuff, but not a lot of stuff. And it's like not overwhelming, but it's also not literally nothing. I don't know. I'm waxing about 3rd edition now. But this also ties into what Mr. Brandis is saying here, is that, when we played this mega dungeon in Pathfinder 1, Dragon's Delve, because it was unique and fantastic, you could create these really, really interesting situations. And that's what I want the dungeon to do. I don't really necessarily care if it's realistic. I want it to be a fun place to play these role-playing games. And Curio asks our last question. He says, what are the issues that come with reskinning mega dungeons? Nothing I can think of. I mean, if you obviously want the tone to be the same, but I mean, I would worry that you maybe mess up the feel of the dungeon too much if you reskin some things and it doesn't make sense anymore. But I guess my question is, why would you want to reskin it? Like to what? But I love PF1. I have a love-hate relationship with PF1. I will freely admit that. Like by the end of PF1, I was so sick of the archetypes and, all the different classes and all the different archetypes of all the different classes. It was too much by the end. And I kind of also agree with that. 3.x is paradoxically the best version of D&D and also the one that I least want to play. That's kind of how I feel. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the only thing I will say is this: is one of the reasons why dungeons, as underground dungeons, feel work is because, like I said, the game has 50 years of spells and abilities that are designed to work inside dungeons. All of those weird, wacky, wonky spells are kind of designed to be used in underground, ruined locations, and you get a lot more mileage out of the game. You get a lot more juice out of the squeeze because these spells are designed to support that style of play. And they still are, even in 5th edition D&D. Ironically, they're oftentimes still there in PF2. But I can literally not imagine a situation where you would ever cast Tensor's Floating Disc or whatever they've rebranded it to now, Floating Force Box or something, in the remaster. Well, I can literally never imagine why you would ever want to cast that. I mean, it's a tough stretch maybe in 5e too, but it's part of the game's DNA, because the game is supposed to be about going underground and dealing with, doors and corridors and traps and all the stuff that is part of, supposed to be a dungeon. Yeah, I think generally speaking, all of us, kind of feel the same. I mean, PF1 3rd edition, I think they kind of all occupy that point where it's like, I understand part of my love for that was the nostalgia. And I also understand part of my love for 3rd edition came from the fact that at the time when I was playing it, I had, 10 plus hours a week that I could put into playing it. And it's one of those games that if you have a ton of time, it's hard work to get the juice out of 3rd edition, but it's good juice. And so if you have the time, it's worth the time. But if you don't have the time, it's almost not worth the time. If you're not willing to put in the time to really make it worth your while, then it's almost not worth it. So nowadays I kind of go for, easier, cheaper thrills, because I don't have the time to put in that kind of effort. So saying I missed 3 point. I think we all feel that way. 100%. I missed 3.x, but not enough to go back to it. Yeah, absolutely. Well, that was all of the questions from the patrons. So yeah, good stuff. Oh, it's 9:30. So anyways, awesome. It was cool. We had Rich show up today. We had George show up today. We had Smith show up today. We had Ben, Boothby, GM Scott, the whole crew. Damien was here. Good stuff. So I'm actually very excited. I'm going over to Smith's house tomorrow, and I am going to, like old times, I'm going over to Smith's tomorrow. I finally get to give him his gift, which I've been sitting on for like 3 months. So that'll be fun. And game pending. We'll say that. Don't worry, I almost did too, so that's quite all right. But I didn't bring it to dinner because I was like, well, I don't want to give it to him when we're out. I'm like, I'll just give it to him the next time I go over his house, and then that hasn't happened since like December, or before December, I should say. You start a new PF2 campaign tomorrow. Awesome. I don't know when I'm going to play Pathfinder 2 again, but I will sometime. I think I kind of, the remaster, going through it with the patrons, I'm pretty happy what they did for the most part. I wish they had done more. I'd love to see what they do with if they update some of the other stuff there, So, I'm not there yet, but at some point I want to revisit Pathfinder 2. The next time I really want, grids and squares, I think I might want to go back to Pathfinder 2. And that will happen. I mean, the curse of me is that, as much as I love PBTA and all these other games, and they're fun, and they are great games, and I really do enjoy them. And a lot of times when I'm playing them, I'm like, oh my God, this is so fast and so furious, and the action is fast paced and it's just going down. There's always a time where I go, man, I miss minis. I like having that kind of slow process of setting up a cool fight and having my little minis and moving around and using cool terrain pieces and having a really, like setting up a flank. I mean, I'm like such a nerd. I remember I used to have all like the Dwarven Forge and stuff, and I used to sit right. So, but this is the problem, Smith, is like I say this, because it's, we haven't played Pathfinder 2 since the beginning of 2024 when we finished Abomination Vaults. And I really haven't, we played Forbidden Lands and I haven't played anything else. Well, no, but I get really excited. And then the first time we flank, it's awesome. And then the conga line happens and it's like, ha 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 ha. And then after like a month of that, I start to go, like, what are we even doing here? But, that was like the best Pathfinder 2 fight we ever had, I think. I mean, it's got to be close to it. It was awesome. We were talking about the final fight of Abomination Vault, where they fought Belcora, but it was awesome. It was a really, really cool fight, and we had fun with it a lot. And why did it happen? Well, because we bent the rules kind of a little bit, but it was very much in the spirit of the rules. So like that was the good part. It was maybe not what they intended, but it was definitely in the spirit of the rules, and it felt very appropriate, which is, I think, what makes everything work for me. And then number two, that fight itself felt very, asymmetrical, because you were trying to, we were trying, you weren't just trying to beat down the bag of hit points, the math was tight. I mean, again, it worked out. But yeah, like having that whole secondary objective of attaching the shards and stuff was very, very cool. Again, I thought the first adventure was really good. I thought the last adventure was pretty good, although we did skip the one level. That middle adventure, though, that one had some problems. Now, be clear, Travis, I feel the same way. After like 6 months of running maps and minis and terrain, I start to get a little tired of it, and I will go just like, let's go do our thing. Let's go do something else. And then I go play PBTA, Dungeon World, Blaze in the Dark. I'm like, oh my God, this is so fast and so awesome. But then after I play that for 6 months, I start missing my little toys, because I like the little toys. What's wrong with liking? I like the toys. Who doesn't like a good toy? I like a good toy. I don't have a 3D printer. If I did, it would be like 10 times worse. So, but yeah. Anyways, gaming tomorrow. That's going to be awesome. Torchbearer campaigns coming. So the word is, we have 2 Torchbearer campaigns happening. One with both with the patrons, but one with Bob and some of our patrons, and another one with the patrons. The one group doesn't want, I don't even know who. It was anonymous, which is totally fine. One group does not want to be on YouTube. Totally understand that. But the other group with Bob doesn't care. So one of our Torchbearer groups is going to be recorded, and we're going to make that available on YouTube. So I have to create a stream, not a stream overlay, because it's not going to be live, but it'll probably be pre-recorded. Now, it won't have like maybe quite the production value that some of our previous things had, because we had like live producers and stuff like that. But I think it'll be fun to get some Torchbearer on the channel. So I'm really looking forward to that. But that's coming. That's coming in February. So I think that'll be really cool. And I'm looking forward to playing those and getting some Torchbearer games in. Speaking of dungeons. And then, we're definitely queuing up here in 2025 to get our home game going. Again, our Forbidden Lands campaign ended in the fall, and we kind of basically took the entire holiday, October, November, December off. So, and most of January. So good to be getting back to that as well. Right. Exactly. I miss the days when I was, in some ways I miss the days when I was married to D&D. There was a time in my life where like the 5e people are, I was basically a game guy. And I've enjoyed, branching out into other games, but, it was a little bit simpler when your entire world was only this big and you could only pick this only, one thing. Well, Damien, I've done the alternating game things too, as well. And I do think that's, I'm hoping that, running Torchbearer and then running something else that isn't Torchbearer and that can, kind of keep me excited. I don't have it in me to do the Ben thing and run 6 games a week. I just can't do that. But I guess I stream, so that's part of it. All right, folks. Well, it's 9:30. I want to say thanks to Boothby, Shadram, Duncan, Dr. Metropolis for the tips tonight. That was very nice of you all. Appreciate that. And for everybody, thanks for coming in. Now, couple things. Next week, I'm taking some time off from work, which is cool. And Tuesday, we're going to have Tundalis from our Patreon on. Now, Tundalis is the creator of Trespasser, which is that sort of OSR exploration proceduralism plus 4E style combat. And he created a very early draft, but he just released a version 2 of Trespasser, which is available on his itch site, itch.io. If you look up Trespasser, he's going to be on the show Tuesday. We're going to talk with him about his game design and we're going to talk with him about what he's doing and some of the stuff that Vin and I spent 2 or 3 hours one night last week going over it, reading the PDF kind of together, co-reading, and talking about it. And there's some really cool stuff in there. I really want to talk to him about Sparks and Shadows. I think that's really interesting. And then Thursday, I'm not going to have a Thursday night stream because I have to go pick up my roommate from the airport. But I'm going to do a Thursday middle of the day stream for our European friends. So it might be like a short lunchtime stream for me, but for them, it'll be, more reasonable around 6 or 7 o'clock PM for them. So that's what we're going to be doing next week. As to what we're going to be doing on that Thursday, I have no idea, but stay tuned. And as always, we'll see you next time on Night's the Last Call. Good night, everybody.